Mars is millions of kilometers away from Earth, a journey that takes months crossing the dark void of space. It seems simple to send a ship there, but the truth is much more frightening. Imagine being trapped in a metal box the size of a small bus, traveling for 8 months with no way back, no way to ask for help if something goes wrong. Space radiation passes through your body every day, weakening your bones and muscles, while you float weightless. And when you finally arrive on Mars, the red planet has dust storms the size of entire continents, temperatures that freeze anything in seconds, and an atmosphere so thin that your blood would boil if you stepped outside without protection. Ships break, systems fail, and in deep space, you are completely alone. But why then do scientists and explorers still want to go? What does Mars have that is worth risking everything? Get ready to relax and sleep while we explore the real and fascinating dangers of a crewed mission to the red planet. From mechanical failures to the mysterious effects on the human body and mind that can happen far from home. Subscribe to the channel. Leave your like and comment from what part of the world you are watching. Get comfortable and relax. Let's begin. Did you know that astronauts traveling to Mars would receive more radiation in a single day than most of us experience in an entire year? That's right. And it's one of the most serious challenges facing human exploration of the red planet. When we talk about sending people to Mars, radiation exposure isn't just a minor concern, it's potentially life-threatening. On Earth, we're incredibly fortunate to have natural protection from space radiation. Our planet's magnetic field acts like an invisible shield, deflecting harmful cosmic rays, while our atmosphere provides additional layers of protection. Astronauts leaving Earth's protective bubble face a completely different reality. The journey to Mars exposes them to two main types of radiation that are particularly concerning: galactic cosmic radiation and solar particle events. Galactic cosmic radiation consists of high-energy particles that originate from outside our solar system. These particles are accelerated to nearly the speed of light by distant supernova explosions and other cosmic events. They're incredibly energetic. Think of them as microscopic bullets traveling through space. When these particles hit human tissue, they can damage or break DNA strands within our cells. The body tries to repair this damage, but sometimes repairs are incorrect, which can lead to mutations and potentially cancer. What makes cosmic radiation especially dangerous is that it's constant and unavoidable during deep space travel. Solar radiation presents another serious threat. Our sun regularly releases bursts of radiation during solar flares and coronal mass ejections. These solar particle events can deliver radiation doses that would be immediately dangerous or even lethal to unprotected astronauts. Unlike the constant cosmic radiation, solar events are unpredictable and can occur with little warning. A major solar storm during a Mars mission could deliver radiation doses hundreds of times higher than normal background levels in just hours. The duration of a Mars mission dramatically increases radiation exposure. We're talking about a minimum 6-month journey each way, plus time spent on the Martian surface. Current estimates suggest astronauts on a Mars mission would receive a total radiation dose that exceeds NASA's career lifetime limits for astronauts. These limits exist because beyond certain thresholds, the risk of developing fatal cancer increases significantly. Some scientific models suggest Mars astronauts could face a 3 to 5% increase in their lifetime cancer risk just from the radiation exposure during their mission. The human brain is particularly vulnerable to cosmic radiation damage. Studies on mice exposed to similar radiation have shown concerning results, including cognitive impairment, reduced ability to respond to novel situations, and signs of accelerated brain aging for Mars astronauts. This could mean difficulty completing complex tasks or making critical decisions, exactly what you don't want during a dangerous mission millions of miles from home. Current spacecraft don't provide adequate protection against this radiation. The aluminum hull of typical spacecraft only blocks a portion of cosmic rays. Water, hydrogen-rich materials, and plastics offer better protection, but the amount needed for effective shielding would make spacecraft too heavy to launch with our current technology. Some promising concepts involve surrounding crew quarters with water tanks or waste storage, effectively using materials that would be on board anyway as partial radiation shields. Mars itself offers only limited protection. Unlike Earth, Mars lost its magnetic field billions of years ago and has a very thin atmosphere, providing just a fraction of the radiation protection we enjoy on Earth. Even on the Martian surface, astronauts would need to limit their time outside or develop habitats with substantial shielding, possibly using Martian soil piled on top of structures. Biological effects of space radiation differ from radiation we encounter on Earth. Medical radiation treatments and even nuclear accidents produce primarily X-rays and gamma rays. Space radiation includes heavy ions, atoms stripped of electrons and accelerated to enormous speeds. These particles can cause more complex damage to cells than typical radiation on Earth. Our understanding of these effects comes largely from laboratory studies and limited space station data, as no human has yet travelled far enough from Earth for long enough to experience comparable exposure. Timing matters too. The solar cycle follows roughly 11-year patterns of high and low activity. Missions planned during solar minimum would experience less solar radiation but more galactic cosmic radiation, as the Sun's reduced activity actually allows more cosmic rays to enter our solar system. Planners must carefully consider these cycles when scheduling potential Mars missions. The risk isn't just about cancer. Radiation exposure can damage the cardiovascular system, potentially leading to heart disease years after the mission. The central nervous system can suffer both acute and long-term effects. Even the digestive tract is vulnerable, with radiation potentially damaging the intestinal lining and affecting nutrient absorption. The immune system typically becomes suppressed under radiation exposure, making astronauts more susceptible to illness at a time when they're far from medical facilities. Developing countermeasures remains an active area of research. Some compounds show promise as radioprotectants, medications that could help the body resist radiation damage. Antioxidants and anti-inflammatory drugs might mitigate some effects, though nothing approaching a complete solution exists yet. Genetic screening might eventually identify individuals with natural resistance to radiation damage, though such selection raises ethical questions about who gets to go to Mars. Real-time monitoring would be essential during a Mars mission. Dosimeters would track radiation exposure, allowing astronauts to retreat to more shielded areas during solar events. Advanced warning systems using spacecraft positioned between the Sun and the crew could provide precious hours of notice before solar radiation arrives. Despite all these challenges, the radiation problem isn't necessarily insurmountable. It represents a serious health risk that must be balanced against the value of Mars exploration. Future technologies like advanced materials, more efficient propulsion reducing travel time, or even magnetic shielding generated around the spacecraft could eventually reduce the risks to more acceptable levels. But with our current capabilities, radiation exposure remains one of the most serious obstacles to sending humans safely to the Red Planet. Impacts of prolonged microgravity on the human body. Imagine floating weightlessly for months on end. Sounds fun, right? But what if your body started to waste away, your bones becoming brittle, your heart growing weaker, and your vision blurring? This is the reality astronauts face during long-duration spaceflight, and it represents a major hurdle for human missions to Mars. The human body evolved over millions of years under Earth's consistent gravitational pull. Take that away, and virtually every bodily system begins to change in ways that can threaten both immediate mission success and long-term health. A journey to Mars would subject astronauts to microgravity for at least 6 months during transit, followed by partial gravity on the Martian surface, then another 6 months of microgravity on the return journey. The cumulative effects could be devastating without proper countermeasures. Let's start with the musculoskeletal system, which shows some of the most dramatic changes in space. on Earth. Simply standing against gravity provides constant resistance that maintains muscle mass and bone density. In microgravity, muscles rapidly atrophy without this constant work. Studies from the International Space Station show astronauts can lose up to 20% of their muscle mass on missions lasting just 5 to 6 months, despite rigorous exercise programs. The muscles most affected are those that work against gravity on Earth, particularly those in the legs, back, and neck. Bone loss in space is equally concerning. Bones maintain their strength through constant remodeling, building up where stress is applied and breaking down where it isn't needed. Without gravity's loading forces, this balance shifts toward breakdown. Astronauts typically lose 1 to 2% of bone mineral density per month in microgravity over a 3-year Mars mission. This could mean losing 15 to 20% of bone mass in critical areas like the hips and spine. This level of bone loss mirrors severe osteoporosis on Earth and significantly increases fracture risk, not what you want when you're millions of miles from medical help. The cardiovascular system undergoes dramatic remodeling in microgravity as well. On Earth, your heart works against gravity to pump blood upward to your brain. In space, this effort isn't required, so the heart becomes deconditioned. Blood and fluids shift upward, giving astronauts puffy faces and chicken legs as fluid leaves the lower extremities. This fluid shift affects blood pressure regulation and can cause problems when astronauts return to a gravity environment. After long-duration missions, some astronauts cannot stand without fainting because their cardiovascular systems have forgotten how to compensate for gravity's pull. Perhaps the most unexpected microgravity effect involves vision. Many astronauts on the International Space Station have experienced what NASA calls spaceflight-associated neuroocular syndrome, or SANS. The symptoms include flattening of the eyeball, swelling of the optic nerve, and vision changes that sometimes persist long after returning to Earth. Scientists believe this may be caused by increased pressure in the head as fluids shift upward in microgravity. Some astronauts have required prescription glasses in space after launching with perfect vision. The human nervous system also struggles in microgravity. Without the constant input of gravity, astronauts experience disorientation and space motion sickness, particularly in the early days of a mission. The brain eventually adapts to the new environment, but this adaptation causes problems upon return to gravity. Balance, coordination, and spatial awareness all become compromised. Astronauts returning from long missions often struggle with basic tasks like walking in a straight line or standing still with their eyes closed. The immune system becomes compromised in microgravity too. Studies show altered immune cell function and reactivation of dormant viruses in astronauts' bodies during spaceflight. This immunosuppression could leave Mars-bound travelers vulnerable to infections or other illnesses at a time when medical care is extremely limited. Sleep disruption represents another significant challenge. Astronauts on the International Space Station witness 16 sunrises and sunsets daily as they orbit Earth every 90 minutes. This plays havoc with circadian rhythms. Many rely on sleep medications, which isn't ideal for long-duration missions where cognitive performance is critical. Poor sleep compounds other physiological stresses and can affect mood and decision-making. Radiation exposure, which we discussed earlier, interacts with microgravity effects in potentially dangerous ways. Bone marrow, which produces blood cells and is central to immune function, is both sensitive to radiation and affected by microgravity-induced bone loss, creating a concerning double impact. Current countermeasures focus primarily on exercise. Astronauts on the International Space Station spend approximately 2 hours daily using specialized equipment, including treadmills with bungee systems, resistance devices, and stationary bicycles. While these help, they only partially mitigate the deconditioning effects. Even with rigorous exercise, astronauts returning from 6-month missions require weeks or months of rehabilitation to regain full function. Advanced countermeasures under development include artificial gravity, created by spinning all or part of a spacecraft. This could theoretically prevent many microgravity effects, but introduces engineering challenges and potential new problems like motion sickness. Pharmaceutical approaches might help maintain bone and muscle mass, though long-term use raises concerns about side effects. The partial gravity on Mars presents its own unknowns. At 38% of Earth's gravity, Mars would provide some loading on the musculoskeletal system, but whether this is sufficient to halt or reverse spaceflight-induced degeneration remains uncertain. The transition from microgravity during transit to Mars gravity would be physically demanding at a time when astronauts need to be at their best to establish operations on the planet. The psychological impact of physical deconditioning shouldn't be underestimated either. Astronauts are typically high-performing individuals accustomed to physical capability. Experiencing weakness, balance problems, or vision changes can affect confidence and mental well-being during an already stressful mission. Finally, there's the return to Earth after years away. The process of readapting to full gravity after such prolonged exposure to microgravity and Mars gravity would likely be more difficult than anything experienced by astronauts to date. Recovery could take months, with some effects potentially permanent. The combined assault of radiation exposure and microgravity-induced changes might create long-term health issues that follow astronauts for the rest of their lives. Despite these challenges, humans are remarkably adaptable. With proper preparation, carefully designed countermeasures, and continued research, we may find ways to protect future Mars explorers from the worst effects of prolonged microgravity. But make no mistake, sending humans to Mars means asking them to accept physical changes and risks that go far beyond anything in our evolutionary experience. The human body would be venturing into uncharted territory, just as surely as the spacecraft itself. Beyond the physical challenges of microgravity and radiation, the human mind faces its own set of daunting obstacles on a journey to Mars. The psychological impact of extreme isolation during such a mission represents one of the most significant risks to crew well-being and mission success. Unlike physical health concerns that can often be measured and monitored with instruments, psychological effects are subtler but potentially just as devastating. A Mars mission would create isolation more extreme than humans have ever experienced. The crew would be confined to a habitat roughly the size of a small house for up to 3 years. At its maximum distance, Mars is about 249 million miles from Earth, with radio signals taking up to 20 minutes each way. This means no real-time conversations with loved ones, mission control, or anyone outside the small crew. No quick calls home when feeling down. No immediate help during emergencies. Just a handful of people, totally dependent on each other, watching Earth shrink to a pale blue dot in the spacecraft window. This isolation creates what psychologists call an ICE environment: isolated, confined, and extreme. Studies of similar environments on Earth, like Antarctic research stations, nuclear submarines, and space station missions, provide some insights into the psychological challenges. But a Mars mission would exceed all of these in duration and distance. The isolation would be more profound than anything humans have faced before. One of the most well-documented effects in isolated environments is what polar researchers call the third quarter phenomenon. During the first phase of isolation, crew members typically experience excitement and novelty. The middle phase brings routine and stability. But as the mission crosses the halfway point, psychological issues tend to emerge. Irritability increases, sleep quality deteriorates, and conflicts between crew members become more frequent and intense. For Mars astronauts, this difficult third quarter could last months, occurring when they're farthest from Earth and facing the psychological reality that they're still a very long way from home. The crew would also experience what psychologists call sensory deprivation. The unchanging environment inside a spacecraft or Mars habitat with the same walls, same smells, same sounds day after day, year after year, deprives the brain of the variety it naturally craves. On Earth, we take for granted the ever-changing sensory experiences of weather, seasons, diverse social interactions, and natural environments. Without these, astronauts commonly report feelings of monotony that can lead to depression, irritability, and even perceptual disturbances. Some Antarctic winter-over crew members have described hallucinations after months in the unchanging white landscape, a concerning prospect for Mars astronauts who would face far longer isolation. Social dynamics become enormously important in isolated environments. A small crew living in close quarters cannot escape interpersonal conflicts. Minor annoyances that would be manageable on Earth, someone's laugh, eating habits, or personal quirks, can magnify into serious tensions when there's no escape and mission success depends on cooperation. Studies from Antarctic stations show that crew members sometimes form cliques or scapegoat individuals, creating harmful group dynamics that persist for months. For a Mars mission, careful crew selection, considering not just individual psychological resilience but group compatibility, would be essential. The communication delay with Earth creates unique psychological stresses. Imagine having an emotional crisis or family emergency and having to wait 40 minutes for a response to your message. The inability to have natural conversations with loved ones erodes social support that helps maintain mental health. Even with video messages, the lack of immediate feedback changes communication in fundamental ways. The crew becomes psychologically detached from Earth, relying primarily on each other for emotional support, potentially creating harmful insular thinking patterns. Privacy becomes both precious and nearly impossible in the confined spaces of a Mars mission. Humans need personal space and time alone to process emotions and recover from social stresses. Yet spacecraft design is driven by efficiency, with every cubic inch carefully allocated. Even on the International Space Station, astronauts have tiny personal quarters, but at least they can gaze at Earth through the windows. Mars astronauts would face years with minimal personal space and no beautiful home planet filling their view for most of the journey. Sleep disruption compounds psychological stress. Without the natural day-night cycle of Earth, circadian rhythms can become desynchronized. Poor sleep quality has been documented in isolated environments even with artificial day-night lighting. Sleep problems then affect mood, decision-making, and interpersonal relationships, creating a cycle of deteriorating psychological health that can be difficult to break. The constant awareness of danger creates another form of psychological pressure. Mars astronauts would know that equipment failures or medical emergencies could be fatal with no possibility of rescue. This background stress, even when not consciously focused upon, takes a physiological toll that accumulates over time. The body's stress response systems remain partially activated, contributing to sleep difficulties. Immune system suppression and cognitive changes, boredom and monotony present another challenge. Despite having scientific work to perform, astronauts would still face significant downtime during a years-long mission. The novelty of space travel wears off, and even dedicated professionals can struggle with motivation when performing maintenance tasks or experiments month after month in isolation. The loss of meaning and purpose that can accompany extreme boredom represents a serious psychological risk. Earth-based simulations like the Mars 500 experiment, which isolated 6 volunteers for 520 days, and HIC's Hawaii Space Exploration Analog and Simulation missions have attempted to understand these psychological challenges. They've confirmed many of the concerns while highlighting the importance of crew autonomy, meaningful work, private communications with family, and virtual reality technologies that could provide sensory variety and a psychological escape from confinement. Potential countermeasures include careful crew selection, psychological training, private audio-visual communications with family, designed social interactions and celebrations, virtual reality environments providing sensory stimulation, meaningful scientific work throughout the mission, and possibly even support animals. Some researchers have suggested that crew composition should include married couples or close friends with pre-existing bonds to provide more stable social dynamics. Ultimately, the psychological challenges of a Mars mission may prove as difficult to overcome as the physical ones. The human mind evolved in a world of sensory variety, natural environments, and diverse social interactions, asking it to function optimally during years of isolation in a confined artificial environment, millions of miles from Earth, tests the boundaries of our psychological adaptability. The psychological and physical challenges of a Mars mission are deeply intertwined with another critical aspect: the life support systems that must keep the crew alive for years without external resupply. These closed-loop systems represent some of the most complex and failure-sensitive technologies required for deep space exploration. On Earth, we take for granted the planetary life support system that recycles our air, purifies our water, and processes our waste. Our planet's biosphere handles these functions automatically through natural cycles that have evolved over billions of years. In space, we must recreate these processes in miniature with mechanical and biological systems that cannot fail for the duration of the mission. The International Space Station provides our best current model for space life support. But even this system requires regular resupply from Earth and maintenance with replacement parts. A Mars mission would need to function reliably for at least 3 years with minimal outside support, a duration that far exceeds our current operational experience. The most critical life support function is maintaining breathable air. Humans consume oxygen and produce carbon dioxide at a steady rate. In space, this carbon dioxide must be continuously removed and fresh oxygen generated. Current systems use molecular sieves called zeolites to capture carbon dioxide from cabin air. This captured carbon dioxide can either be vented to space, an unsustainable approach for long missions, or, ideally, converted back into oxygen. The oxygen regeneration process typically uses water electrolysis, splitting water molecules into oxygen for breathing and hydrogen. The hydrogen can then react with captured carbon dioxide through what's called the Sabatier process to produce methane and water. The water goes back into the system, completing part of the cycle, though the methane is currently considered a waste product. This process is not perfectly efficient. Some resources are lost with each cycle, meaning Mars missions would need to carry reserves. Water recycling presents another major challenge. A human requires approximately 2 litres of drinking water daily, plus water for hygiene, food preparation, and other uses, totaling about 50 litres per person per day in a minimal usage scenario. Carrying all this water for a 3-year mission would be prohibitively heavy. Instead, advanced water recycling systems must process everything from urine and sweat to moisture in breath and shower runoff. The water recovery system on the International Space Station reclaims approximately 90% of water, but a Mars mission would need even higher efficiency. These systems use a combination of filtration, distillation, and chemical treatment to purify water, but they're complex, prone to clogging, and require regular maintenance. The psychological aspect of drinking recycled water, knowing its previous uses, also presents a potential barrier that crews must overcome. Waste management in closed systems extends beyond human biological waste to include packaging materials, food scraps, worn clothing, and other items that accumulate during a mission. On the International Space Station, solid waste is often packed into supply vehicles that burn up in Earth's atmosphere upon return, not an option during a Mars transit. Long-duration missions would need to either store waste, consuming precious space, or develop new technologies to break it down into useful components. Food systems for a Mars mission would likely combine shelf-stable pre-packaged foods with some fresh foods grown on board. While growing all food needed for a Mars mission remains beyond current capabilities, even limited fresh food production would provide nutritional benefits and significant psychological comfort. Plants also assist with air revitalization, absorbing carbon dioxide and releasing oxygen through photosynthesis. However, space-based agriculture introduces additional complexities. Plants require lighting, nutrients, water, and proper atmospheric composition. They generate humidity that must be managed. They can harbour pests or develop diseases in the closed environment of a spacecraft. And they require significant power, particularly lighting, as efficient LED technology still consumes substantial electricity to provide the spectrum plants need for growth. Temperature and humidity control represents another critical life support function. Spacecraft generate heat through electronics, human metabolism, and other processes. This heat must be removed to maintain comfortable conditions. On the International Space Station, excess heat transfers to large radiator panels that dissipate it into space. A Mars spacecraft would need similar capabilities, with the added challenge of maintaining thermal control during different mission phases with varying heat loads and external conditions. All these life support systems consume power, creating dependencies on reliable energy generation and storage. Solar panels typically provide primary power for spacecraft, but their efficiency decreases as the spacecraft moves away from the Sun, generating about half as much power at Mars compared to Earth. This power limitation constrains life support design, forcing engineers to maximize efficiency and provide redundant systems for critical functions. Microbiological management presents unique challenges in closed environments. Bacteria and fungi naturally grow in warm, humid conditions where humans live. In Earth's open environment, this typically presents minimal concerns. In the closed loop of a spacecraft, however, microorganisms can multiply rapidly, potentially causing health issues, equipment corrosion, and contamination of water or air systems. Regular cleaning, antimicrobial surfaces, and careful monitoring become essential. Redundancy and repair capabilities are fundamental to life support system design. Critical components must have backups, ideally using different technologies to avoid common mode failures. The crew needs the ability to repair systems using available parts or fabricate replacements, possibly using 3D printing technology. However, each redundant system adds mass and complexity to the mission. Bioregenerative life support systems, which use living organisms like algae or plants to perform life support functions more naturally, offer promising capabilities for future missions. These biological systems can simultaneously provide fresh food, oxygen generation, carbon dioxide removal, and psychological benefits. However, they're currently less reliable and more resource-intensive than mechanical systems, making a hybrid approach most likely for early Mars missions. The interconnection between these various systems creates both opportunities and risks. Water recycling affects humidity control. Air management influences plant growth. Waste processing relates to water recovery. This interconnectedness means that a failure in one system can cascade through others, potentially creating emergency situations that must be anticipated and mitigated through careful design. The psychological dimension of living with these systems cannot be overlooked. The crew must trust that their air and water are safe. Despite knowing exactly what these resources contained before recycling, they must maintain complex systems while dealing with the cognitive effects of isolation and microgravity. And they must handle emergency repairs in life-critical systems, potentially under extreme time pressure, millions of miles from direct assistance. Despite these enormous challenges, progress in closed-loop life support continues. The International Space Station serves as a testbed for technologies that will eventually support Mars missions. Analog environments on Earth, like NASA's Human Exploration Research Analog and various sealed habitat experiments, provide opportunities to test integrated systems. With continued development and testing, we move closer to creating the robust life support technologies that will someday sustain human explorers on the long journey to Mars and back. While reliable life support systems are essential throughout a Mars mission, they face perhaps their greatest test during one of the most dangerous phases of the entire journey, landing on the Martian surface. After surviving months of radiation exposure, microgravity, psychological challenges, and the constant demands of maintaining life support, the crew must then successfully execute what engineers call EDL, entry, descent, and landing, in an environment that's particularly unforgiving of errors. Landing on Mars represents one of the most complex and risky maneuvers in spaceflight, unlike Earth landings, where a thick atmosphere allows spacecraft to gradually slow down, or moon landings, where there's no atmosphere at all. Mars presents a worst of both worlds scenario. Its atmosphere is thick enough to create dangerous heating during entry, but too thin to provide sufficient drag for slowing down large, heavy spacecraft carrying humans and their habitats. This atmospheric challenge has led engineers to describe Mars landings as trying to stop something traveling at approximately 12,000 miles per hour, using an atmosphere that's less than 1% as dense as Earth's. The thin Martian atmosphere means traditional parachutes alone cannot safely land the massive payloads required for human missions. Current Mars rovers, which are tiny compared to what would be needed for human missions, already push the limits of our landing capabilities. The Curiosity rover, which landed in 2012, weighed less than 1 ton and used what NASA called 7 minutes of terror, an elaborate sequence involving a heat shield, supersonic parachute, and a rocket-powered sky crane to gently lower the rover to the surface. A human mission would require landing at least 20 to 40 tons of equipment safely, a mass increase of more than 20 times. This dramatic scaling up of landing mass creates engineering challenges that we haven't yet solved. The sequence of a Mars landing would likely start with the spacecraft using its heat shield to slow down from interplanetary velocities. This shield would experience temperatures over 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit as it compresses the thin Martian atmosphere ahead of it. Even small defects in the shield could lead to catastrophic failure. After initial deceleration, the spacecraft would likely deploy a massive supersonic parachute, much larger than anything we've tested so far, to further slow its descent. However, parachutes alone cannot bring the spacecraft to a safe landing speed in Mars' thin atmosphere. The final phase would require powered descent using rocket engines. These engines must work perfectly after months in space, igniting at exactly the right moment and throttling precisely to manage the descent. The spacecraft would need to navigate autonomously. As the communications delay with Earth makes real-time control impossible, it would need to detect and avoid hazards like large rocks or slopes that could destabilize the lander upon touchdown. The computational demands during landing are enormous. The spacecraft must process terrain data in real time, calculate trajectories, manage propellant flow, monitor dozens of systems, and make split-second decisions, all with the crew's lives at stake. The entire landing sequence from atmospheric entry to touchdown would last only about 7 to 10 minutes, but it would require years of planning and testing to execute successfully. Martian weather adds another layer of uncertainty to landing operations. Dust storms can arise with little warning, reducing visibility and changing atmospheric density. Seasonal variations in the atmosphere can affect drag calculations. Even daily temperature fluctuations can impact landing conditions. Unlike Earth, where we have extensive weather monitoring systems, Mars weather prediction remains relatively primitive, creating additional risk factors. The landing site selection involves difficult trade-offs between safety and scientific value. The flattest, most hazard-free landing sites are often less interesting scientifically, while the most geologically diverse areas, which might provide better resources or research opportunities, often contain slopes, rocks, and other landing hazards. For a human mission, access to potential resources like subsurface ice would be important, further constraining landing site options. The mass requirements of a human mission create a chicken and egg problem. More crew and equipment means safer operations on Mars, but makes the landing itself more difficult. Multiple landings might be required to deliver all necessary equipment, but this multiplies the chances of a landing failure. Some mission architectures propose sending cargo missions ahead of the crew to pre-position supplies, but these resources would be useless if the crew cannot land near them. The consequences of landing failures are particularly severe for human missions. With robotic missions like the Mars Polar Lander or the European Schiaparelli Lander, failures were disappointing but didn't cost human lives. The historical success rate for all Mars landing attempts hovers around 50%, odds that would be completely unacceptable for crewed missions. This necessitates extensive testing and redundant systems that add weight, complexity, and cost. Abort options during Mars landing are extremely limited, unlike Apollo lunar landings, where the command module remained in orbit, allowing for abort back to orbit if the landing went wrong. A Mars mission might not have this capability due to mass constraints. Once committed to landing, the crew might have no option but to see it through, regardless of emerging problems. This all-or-nothing aspect of Mars landing creates enormous pressure to get every detail right. Testing Mars landing systems on Earth is challenging because our atmosphere and gravity are so different. While we can simulate aspects of the landing in vacuum chambers, wind tunnels, or high-altitude drops, a full end-to-end test of a human-scale Mars landing system might be impossible before actually attempting it on Mars. This means the first human crew would be testing the complete integrated landing system for the first time when their lives depend on it. Communication blackout represents another landing challenge. As the spacecraft enters the Martian atmosphere at high speed, the superheated plasma surrounding it blocks radio signals, creating a period where the crew cannot communicate with Earth or orbiting relay satellites. This blackout would occur at the most critical phase of the landing, adding psychological stress and eliminating the possibility of emergency guidance from mission control. Despite these formidable challenges, engineers are developing technologies to improve Mars landing capabilities. Inflatable heat shields could provide more drag in the thin atmosphere without the weight of traditional rigid shields. Supersonic retropropulsion, firing engines while still moving faster than the speed of sound, shows promise for slowing larger payloads. Terrain relative navigation systems using cameras and computer vision could help spacecraft identify and avoid landing hazards in real time. The good news is that each successful Mars landing teaches us more about the process. The Perseverance rover, which landed in 2021, incorporated lessons from Curiosity and tested technologies like terrain relative navigation that will be essential for human missions. Each incremental advance brings us closer to the capability needed to safely land humans on the Red Planet. Once a crew has survived the harrowing landing sequence and established their surface habitat, they face another significant threat that could emerge at any time during their stay on Mars: global dust storms. These massive meteorological events can engulf the entire planet, creating conditions that threaten equipment, operations, and potentially the crew's survival. Mars experiences dust storms that make the worst sandstorms on Earth seem mild by comparison. While Earth's sandstorms are typically localized events, Martian storms can grow to cover entire regions or even the whole planet. During a global dust storm, the normally reddish Martian sky turns a dark yellow-brown, visibility drops to nearly zero, and the sun becomes a dim disk barely visible through the haze. These conditions can persist not just for days, but for weeks or even months. The mechanics of these storms start with Mars's typical dusty environment. The planet's surface is covered with fine, powder-like dust that has been pulverized over billions of years by meteorite impacts and weathering. This dust is far finer than sand on Earth, more like talcum powder, making it easily lofted into the atmosphere by even gentle winds. Once airborne, the dust particles absorb sunlight, heating the surrounding air. This heating creates temperature differentials that drive stronger winds. which in turn lift more dust, creating a feedback loop that can transform local dust storms into planet-encircling events. Global dust storms don't occur every Martian year, but they're common enough to pose a significant risk for long-duration missions. They tend to form during Mars' perihelion, when the planet is closest to the Sun and receives more solar energy. Scientists are still working to develop reliable prediction methods, but the onset of a global storm might come with only days or weeks of warning, not enough time to evacuate a crew back to Earth, even if that were technically possible. The most immediate threat these storms pose is to power systems. Any Mars mission will likely rely heavily on solar panels for electricity generation, as they're far lighter and simpler than nuclear alternatives. During a global dust storm, sunlight reaching the surface can drop by up to 99%. This drastic reduction would render solar panels nearly useless, forcing the mission to rely on limited battery reserves or auxiliary power systems. We've already witnessed this danger firsthand with robotic missions. In 2018, the Opportunity rover, which had survived on Mars for 14 years, permanently ceased operations when a global dust storm prevented its solar panels from generating enough power to maintain critical systems. A human mission simply cannot afford this kind of power failure, as it would affect life support systems keeping the crew alive. The fine Martian dust creates mechanical hazards beyond just blocking sunlight. This dust is not only incredibly fine, but also electrostatically charged and somewhat magnetic due to iron oxide content. It sticks to and penetrates nearly everything, working its way into seals, joints, motors, and filters. For a human mission, this dust would constantly threaten to degrade critical equipment like airlocks, spacesuits, life support systems, and mobility vehicles. Each time astronauts returned from extravehicular activities, they would inevitably bring dust into the habitat despite their best decontamination efforts. During a global storm, this problem would intensify dramatically. The electrostatically charged particles could potentially damage sensitive electronics through static discharge. Moving mechanical parts would face accelerated wear from the abrasive particles. Optical equipment like cameras and sensors would suffer reduced performance or complete failure as dust coated their surfaces. Visibility reduction during storms creates obvious operational challenges. Astronauts would be unable to travel far from their habitat without risking becoming disoriented and lost. Science operations requiring direct observation of the landscape would be suspended. Even robotic assistants would face navigation difficulties without visual landmarks or with cameras obscured by dust. This enforced confinement would add psychological stress during an already challenging situation. The Martian dust itself may pose health concerns for the crew. Analysis of Martian soil by rovers has revealed the presence of perchlorates, chemicals that are toxic to humans in sufficient concentrations. The dust also contains sharp, unweathered mineral particles that could cause respiratory issues if they entered the habitat in quantity. Proper filtration systems would be essential, but these would require more frequent maintenance and filter replacements during dust storm conditions, creating a higher workload when power might be limited. Temperature fluctuations accompany global dust storms, creating additional environmental challenges. While the dust blocks sunlight from reaching the surface, causing daytime temperatures to drop, it also traps heat at night, preventing the normal rapid cooling that occurs on Mars. These altered thermal patterns would affect habitat temperature regulation systems, potentially requiring more power for heating or cooling at a time when power might be severely limited. Communications with Earth would suffer during global dust storms. While radio signals can penetrate dust, optical communication systems, which offer higher data rates and are being developed for deep space missions, would be severely degraded or unusable. This communication reduction would come precisely when the crew might need increased support from Earth to handle storm-related emergencies. Mission planning must account for the possibility of global dust storms lasting weeks or months. This requires redundant power systems, likely including radioisotope thermoelectric generators, RTGs, to supplement solar power, extra filters, replacement parts, and maintenance supplies would be needed for equipment exposed to dusty conditions. Habitats would require robust dust mitigation systems, including specialized airlocks with improved dust removal capabilities and advanced filtration systems. Navigation systems would need to function without visual references. This might involve deploying local radio beacons around the landing site before a storm hits, allowing astronauts to find their way even in zero visibility conditions. Habitat monitoring would need to detect dust intrusion early, as accumulating dust inside living spaces could create both mechanical and health hazards over time. Testing technologies for Mars dust mitigation on Earth is challenging because Earth doesn't have directly equivalent conditions. While we can simulate some aspects in chambers with artificial dust, the unique combination of particle size, composition, electrostatic properties, and low-pressure environment is difficult to reproduce exactly. This means some dust-related problems might not become apparent until humans are actually on Mars, forcing creative in-situ problem-solving. Despite these challenges, Mars dust isn't an insurmountable problem. Proper engineering, redundant systems, and operational protocols can mitigate the risks. Rovers like Curiosity and Perseverance, which use radioisotope power instead of solar panels, have continued operating through dust storms. Their experiences provide valuable data about storm duration, intensity, and effects that will inform human mission planning, with proper preparation. A human crew could weather even a major global dust storm, though it would certainly test both their equipment and their resolve. While Martian dust storms create significant operational challenges, they only compound a constant reality of Mars missions, the extreme communication limitations that isolate crews from Earth. Throughout human spaceflight history, we've never experienced anything remotely like the communication constraints a Mars mission would face. Even during the most distant Apollo missions to the Moon, radio signals reached Earth in just 1.5 seconds. Mars communications introduced delays measured not in seconds but in minutes, fundamentally changing how the mission must operate. The physics of radio wave propagation creates this unavoidable obstacle. Radio signals travel at the speed of light, and even light takes significant time to cross the vast distance between Earth and Mars. At their closest approach, when the planets are about 35 million miles apart, a one-way radio signal takes about 3 minutes. At their farthest, when they're roughly 250 million miles apart with the Sun between them, that signal takes approximately 22 minutes. This means a simple question asked from Mars might not receive a reply for 44 minutes. This delay eliminates the possibility of real-time conversations between the Mars crew and mission control. The casual radio chatter that characterized earlier space missions would be impossible. Instead, communications would consist of recorded messages, data packages, and carefully crafted updates. Imagine trying to describe a complex technical problem and waiting nearly an hour for the first suggestion on how to fix it. This delay fundamentally changes the relationship between the crew and ground support, requiring unprecedented autonomy from the astronauts. Emergency situations highlight the severity of this communication constraint. If a critical system failure occurs, the crew would be entirely on their own during the most crucial early moments of the crisis. By the time mission control even becomes aware of the emergency, the situation would have evolved for minutes or hours, making Earth-based advice potentially outdated or irrelevant. This reality demands extensive emergency training and onboard decision-making authority, unlike anything required in previous space missions. Beyond the delay, Mars communications face bandwidth limitations that restrict the amount and types of data that can be transmitted. The Deep Space Network, DSN, NASA's system of massive radio antennas that communicate with distant spacecraft, can currently achieve data rates of up to 2 megabits per second with Mars spacecraft under ideal conditions. This sounds reasonable until you consider that a single high-definition video call on Earth typically requires at least 5 megabits per second. The limited bandwidth means carefully rationing communications, prioritizing critical system telemetry, scientific data, and basic crew communications over comfort items like entertainment or high-resolution personal videos from home. The positioning of the planets creates additional communication challenges. When Mars and Earth are on opposite sides of the Sun, a geometric alignment called solar conjunction that occurs once every 26 months, radio signals must pass near the Sun. Solar radiation interferes with these signals, creating a communications blackout that can last up to 2 weeks. During this period, only minimal, highly redundant communications are possible, if any at all. Mission planners must design operations to be fully autonomous during these predictable blackout periods. The physical hardware for Mars communications presents its own challenges. High-gain directional antennas provide the best communication capability, but they must be precisely pointed toward Earth to function. This requires either a steerable antenna with motors and control systems that can fail, or periodic adjustment of the entire spacecraft orientation using precious propellant. Omnidirectional antennas provide backup capability, but with dramatically reduced data rates. Sufficient perhaps for text messages, but not much more. Power requirements for long-distance communications are substantial. Transmitting signals strong enough to reach Earth from Mars requires significant electricity, a precious resource on spacecraft powered by limited solar panels or radioisotope generators. This creates difficult trade-offs between communication time and power available for other critical systems like life support, science instruments, or habitat heating. The psychological impact of communication limitations cannot be overstated. Astronauts would experience a profound sense of isolation unlike anything in previous human experience. Personal communications with family would become precious but strange exchanges of delayed messages rather than conversations. The inability to directly participate in important family moments, birthdays, anniversaries, graduations, or emergencies, would be emotionally taxing. Even receiving news from Earth becomes different when you're reading about events that happened 20 minutes ago with no ability to respond in real time. Innovative solutions are being developed to address some of these challenges. Optical communications using lasers instead of radio waves could dramatically increase bandwidth, potentially allowing video calls and larger data transfers. However, laser communications require even more precise pointing than radio and can be blocked by clouds in Earth's atmosphere or dust in the Martian atmosphere, making them less reliable. They would likely supplement rather than replace traditional radio systems. Communications relay satellites in Mars orbit could provide more consistent contact with surface operations, eliminating line-of-sight issues when surface features block direct Earth communications. Such satellites would need long operational lifetimes and redundant systems to serve as reliable communications infrastructure for human missions. NASA has already begun establishing this network with orbiters like MAVEN and the Mars Reconnaissance Orbiter, which relay data from surface rovers in addition to their primary scientific missions. Autonomous communication scheduling systems are being developed to optimize the use of limited communication windows. These systems would prioritize data transmission based on importance, size, dot, and urgency, ensuring critical information flows first when bandwidth becomes available. For the crew, new asynchronous collaboration tools similar to text and video messaging but optimized for planetary delays could help maintain more natural communication patterns despite the time lag. Advanced AI systems on board the Mars habitat could provide some of the technical support currently handled by mission control, reducing dependency on Earth communications for routine problem-solving. These systems would access vast databases of technical information, mission procedures, and even simulations to help the crew diagnose and resolve issues independently. Despite these advances, The fundamental physics of interplanetary distances means that communication delays and limitations will remain one of the most challenging aspects of Mars exploration. Any crew travelling to Mars must be prepared to operate with unprecedented autonomy, making life and death decisions without real-time input from Earth. This reality shapes every aspect of mission design, crew selection, and training protocols, creating an exploration paradigm very different from the closely monitored and controlled missions we've conducted to date. The communication challenges that isolate Mars crews from Earth support highlight another stark reality of deep space exploration, the complete impossibility of rescue missions for a crew in distress. Unlike virtually every other exploration endeavour in human history, a Mars mission must proceed with the sobering knowledge that if something goes catastrophically wrong, no help will arrive in time. This fundamental truth represents perhaps the most psychologically daunting aspect of Mars exploration, and it shapes mission design in profound ways. The primary obstacle to rescue operations is simply the vast distance involved, even with our fastest current propulsion systems. A one-way trip to Mars takes about 7 to 9 months. This means that even if a fully fueled rescue vehicle were somehow standing by on Earth, an economically impractical scenario, it would arrive long after any acute emergency had reached its conclusion. For comparison, when Apollo 13 suffered its famous oxygen tank explosion, the crew was only 200,000 miles from Earth, allowing mission control to assist with their survival and return. A Mars crew would face emergencies at a distance roughly 1,000 times greater. The launch window constraints for Mars missions compound this problem. Efficient trajectories between Earth and Mars are only available every 26 months when the planets align properly. Miss this window, and the energy requirements for the journey increase dramatically, potentially beyond the capabilities of our most powerful rockets. This means a rescue mission might need to wait more than 2 years for the next viable launch opportunity. Regardless of the urgency of the situation on Mars, resource limitations create another barrier to rescue operations. Any Mars mission already pushes the boundaries of what we can launch from Earth, requiring multiple heavy-lift rocket launches and complex assembly operations just to create the primary mission vehicle. Maintaining a complete backup vehicle and crew in launch readiness, effectively doubling the mission cost, would be economically prohibitive. The resources required for a single Mars mission could fund entire scientific programs on Earth, making the duplication of assets for rescue capability difficult to justify. The technical complexity of a rescue mission would exceed even that of the primary mission. The rescue craft would need to carry extra supplies to sustain both the original crew and rescue team. It would need specialized equipment to address whatever emergency prompted the rescue in the first place. Most challengingly, it would need to land with extreme precision near the distressed crew, a feat we have not yet demonstrated with large Mars landers. All these factors make a traditional rescue mission effectively impossible with current or near-term technology. Medical emergencies highlight the no-rescue paradigm most clearly. A serious injury, appendicitis, or other acute medical condition requiring hospital-level care would need to be handled entirely by the crew's own medical capabilities. The mission's medical officer might be called upon to perform complex procedures with limited equipment and no possibility of evacuation for the patient. This reality necessitates both extensive medical training for multiple crew members and acceptance of higher medical risk than we permit in other human spaceflight programs. System failures present similar challenges. If a critical life support component fails catastrophically, the crew must repair it with onboard resources or develop alternate means of providing that function. Earth can provide advice and procedures via delayed communications, but no replacement parts or specialist repair technicians can arrive. This drives a mission design philosophy of redundant critical systems, extensive spare parts inventories, in-space manufacturing capabilities, and exceptional crew training in repair procedures. The psychological impact of knowing no rescue is possible cannot be overstated. Astronauts must accept this reality during training and internalize it as part of their mission. Studies of polar expeditions, submarine deployments, and other extreme environments suggest that people can adapt to such isolation, but the complete absence of rescue capability for a multi-year duration represents a psychological frontier as uncharted as Mars itself. Mission planners address the no-rescue paradigm through multiple layers of risk mitigation. Redundancy becomes paramount, multiple ways to provide each critical function with independent failure modes. Extensive testing of all systems prior to departure helps identify potential failures before lives depend on them. Careful crew selection identifies individuals with both the technical capability to solve complex problems and the psychological resilience to handle extreme pressure without external support. Some mission architectures incorporate limited self-rescue capabilities. For example, a mission might include a separate Earth return vehicle pre-positioned in Mars orbit. If surface operations become untenable, the crew could potentially return to orbit and begin the journey home earlier than planned. However, even this approach would not address many emergency scenarios, such as rapid decompression events, serious medical conditions requiring immediate intervention, or propulsion failures during the interplanetary transit phases. Advanced technologies may eventually improve emergency response options, though not traditional rescue as we understand it. High-efficiency propulsion systems could potentially reduce Earth-Mars transit times from months to weeks, though such systems remain theoretical. Artificial hibernation or suspended animation technologies might allow crews to reduce metabolic needs during emergencies, extending the viability of limited resources. Though these capabilities remain in early research stages, in situ resource utilization on Mars might provide greater self-sufficiency, reducing dependency on Earth-supplied materials. The reality of no rescue operations fundamentally changes how we must approach Mars exploration. Risk assessment, typically focused on the probability and consequence of failure, must be supplemented with a third dimension, recoverability without external assistance. Mission designers must ask not just what is the likelihood of this failure, but also, if this fails, can the crew recover using only the resources they have with them? Despite these sobering realities, humans have repeatedly demonstrated the capacity to accept and manage extreme risks in pursuit of exploration. From early sea voyages where ships disappeared without trace to Antarctic expeditions where teams were entirely isolated for years, people have ventured beyond the reach of rescue throughout history. Mars represents the modern frontier of this tradition, a destination where the reward of expanding human presence into the solar system must be weighed against the stark reality that those who go must be prepared to survive on their own ingenuity or not at all. The impossibility of rescue doesn't mean Mars exploration is impossible. It means we must approach it with extraordinary preparation, redundancy, and crew capability. It means accepting a level of risk higher than we've permitted in spaceflight programs to date, and it means selecting astronauts who fully understand and accept that their survival will depend entirely on their own resources, skills, and decisions, millions of miles from home with no possibility of outside intervention. Even with the daunting challenges of communication limitations and the impossibility of rescue, Mars explorers would face another profound responsibility: preventing biological contamination in both directions. This concern, often overshadowed by more immediate survival challenges, represents a scientific and ethical dimension of Mars exploration with far-reaching implications. As a pristine environment potentially harbouring evidence of past or present life, Mars presents unique contamination risks that we've never had to address in previous human exploration. The scientific community has long recognised that introducing Earth microbes to Mars could irreversibly compromise our search for Martian life. Every human carries trillions of microorganisms in our digestive systems, on our skin, in our breath. These microbes have evolved alongside us for millions of years, and many are remarkably hardy, capable of surviving extreme conditions, despite our best efforts at sterilisation. Completely eliminating these microbial hitchhikers from human missions would be virtually impossible. Each astronaut would inevitably transport a small but significant portion of Earth's biosphere to Mars. This concern has guided robotic exploration for decades. Current Mars rovers undergo extensive sterilization procedures, including heat treatments, chemical cleaning, and assembly in clean rooms. Even with these precautions, they likely carry some microbial contamination. The acceptable bioburden for robotic missions is carefully calculated based on mission objectives and landing sites. For human missions, the contamination level would be orders of magnitude higher, regardless of precautions. The key worry is that Earth microbes could potentially survive and reproduce in certain Martian microenvironments, particularly in locations where liquid water might occasionally exist. Recent discoveries of recurring slope lineae, dark streaks on crater walls that may indicate seasonal flows of briny water, highlight potential habitats where Earth microbes might find foothold. If Mars harbours its own microbial life, Earth organisms could potentially outcompete or genetically transform these native life forms before we even discover them, forever altering Mars' biological history and erasing evidence that could answer fundamental questions about life in the universe. Forward contamination from Earth to Mars is only half the concern. Back contamination, bringing potentially harmful Martian organisms to Earth, represents another significant risk that must be addressed. While current scientific consensus suggests the Mars surface is likely hostile to life as we know it, with harsh radiation, oxidizing chemicals, and minimal liquid water, we cannot completely rule out the possibility of Martian microorganisms adapted to these conditions. If such organisms exist, humans returning from Mars could potentially transport them back to Earth, where they might find our planet's environment more hospitable. The possibility of harmful biological effects from Martian microorganisms, while considered unlikely by many scientists, cannot be dismissed entirely. Earth's organisms have co-evolved over billions of years, developing complex ecological relationships and immune responses to each other. A truly alien organism might interact with Earth's biosphere in unpredictable ways. The human immune system, having never encountered Martian biology, would have no evolved defenses against potential pathogens. Historical examples of devastating consequences from introducing species to new environments, like the arrival of European diseases in the Americas or the cane toad in Australia, offer cautionary tales about unintended biological introductions. These concerns have led to the development of planetary protection protocols governed by the Committee on Space Research, COSPAR, which provides international guidelines for minimizing contamination risks. For robotic missions, these protocols have been relatively straightforward to implement through sterilization procedures. For human missions, they create significant operational complexities that directly impact mission design, adding layers of quarantine requirements, restricted access zones on Mars, and sample handling protocols. Practical implementation of these protocols would likely require dividing Mars into different zones based on their potential to harbour life or preserve evidence of past life. Special regions, areas where liquid water might exist or where conditions could support Earth organisms, would have strict access limitations. Astronauts might be prohibited from directly entering these regions, instead using sterilized robotic proxies for exploration and sample collection. This creates a frustrating scenario where the most scientifically interesting locations might be off-limits to human explorers, at least until thorough robotic assessment confirms they contain no evidence of life. Habitat design would need to incorporate multiple containment layers to prevent microbial exchange with the Martian environment. Advanced airlock systems would include decontamination capabilities far beyond current spacecraft. Spacesuits would require careful handling and external sterilization before and after each use. Sample handling would necessitate specialized containment facilities within the habitat, adding complexity to an already cramped and resource-limited environment. Return missions would face even more stringent requirements. Astronauts, equipment, and especially any Martian samples would need to undergo quarantine procedures before returning to Earth. Some mission architectures propose a quarantine facility in Earth orbit where samples and potentially the returning crew could be isolated while testing confirms no harmful biological material is present. This adds significant complexity, cost, and risk to the return journey. These contamination concerns create a paradoxical challenge for human Mars exploration. One primary scientific motivation for sending humans to Mars is the search for evidence of life. Yet human presence inherently complicates this search through unavoidable contamination. This has led some scientists to argue that robotic exploration should thoroughly investigate Mars for biosignatures before humans arrive and potentially contaminate the environment. The ethical dimensions extend beyond scientific concerns. If Mars harbours even microbial life, do we have the right to potentially threaten it with Earth organisms? Should an entire planet be preserved in its natural state? These questions have no simple answers, but they must be considered alongside the technical challenges of preventing contamination. International agreements like the Outer Space Treaty require nations to avoid harmful contamination of celestial bodies, but interpretations of this requirement vary when weighing scientific exploration against contamination risks. Despite these challenges, practical approaches are being developed. These include careful site selection for human bases, focusing initial human exploration on regions less likely to harbour life. Improved detection technologies could rapidly analyse soil samples for evidence of life before humans extensively disturb an area. Advances in genetic sequencing might allow quick distinction between potential Martian organisms and known Earth contaminants. New materials and sterilisation techniques could reduce microbial shedding from spacesuits and equipment. Ultimately, complete prevention of biological contamination during human Mars missions is likely impossible. The question becomes one of management and ethical decision-making, determining acceptable levels of risk and implementing protocols that balance exploration goals with scientific preservation and planetary protection. This tension between exploration and preservation represents yet another unique challenge of sending humans to Mars, one that has no precedent in our exploration of Earth and requires careful consideration before the first human bootprints appear in Martian soil. While the challenges of planetary protection require careful protocols and ethical considerations, they at least involve deliberate planning and risk management. The medical risks of Mars exploration, however, present a more immediate and potentially unforgiving threat to crew survival. Human physiology evolved under specific Earth conditions over millions of years. Taking our bodies to the alien environment of Mars creates medical vulnerabilities unlike anything faced in previous space missions or terrestrial exploration. The most fundamental medical challenge is the extreme distance from Earth's medical infrastructure. On the International Space Station, a crew member experiencing a serious medical emergency can return to Earth within hours. Even Apollo astronauts on the Moon could reach Earth within days. Mars offers no such option. A medical emergency on the Red Planet must be handled entirely with the limited resources, equipment, and expertise available in the Mars habitat. This reality fundamentally changes how we must approach space medicine. The range of potential medical emergencies is vast. Traumatic injuries could occur during spacewalks, habitat construction, or exploration activities. Internal medical conditions like appendicitis, kidney stones, or cardiac events can strike otherwise healthy individuals without warning. Dental emergencies, though rarely life-threatening, can cause debilitating pain that impacts performance. Psychological conditions, including severe depression, anxiety, or psychosis, could develop during the mission's extended isolation. Each category requires different equipment, supplies, and expertise to address effectively. For trauma care, the Mars habitat would need capabilities approaching a small emergency department, including diagnostic imaging, surgical facilities, blood products or substitutes, and post-operative care resources. All this must fit within severe mass and volume constraints and be operable by crew members with medical training that would inevitably be less extensive than Earth-based emergency physicians and surgeons. while astronauts with medical backgrounds would certainly be included in the crew. They cannot reasonably maintain proficiency across all medical specialties that might be needed. Surgery in the Martian environment introduces unique complications. The partial gravity of Mars, about 38% of Earth's, would affect fluid behaviours during procedures. Blood wouldn't pool as expected, instruments would handle differently, and surgeon fatigue would manifest differently than in familiar Earth conditions. Surgical procedures developed on Earth would need modification for the Martian environment. Yet, surgeons would have minimal opportunity to practice under these conditions before the mission. Anesthesia presents its own challenges. The complex pharmacology of anesthetic agents might function differently in the Martian environment and in bodies already altered by microgravity exposure during transit. Dosing would need adjustment, and the margin for error would be smaller without the backup resources available in Earth hospitals. The physical isolation of a Mars habitat also eliminates the option of specialized anesthesiologists. Crew physicians would need broad competence across multiple medical disciplines. Diagnostic capabilities would be severely constrained by mass and power limitations. While advances in miniaturization have created portable versions of many medical technologies, comprehensive diagnostic capability would still require difficult trade-offs. A single diagnostic device that fails could create a critical gap in medical capability for the remainder of the mission. Redundancy in critical medical systems would compete with other mission requirements for the limited payload capacity. Pharmaceutical concerns extend beyond anesthesia to all medications. Drug stability over the multi-year mission duration remains largely untested. Radiation exposure during transit and on the Martian surface could degrade medications, potentially rendering them ineffective or even toxic. Extended shelf life beyond manufacturer specifications would be necessary, yet difficult to validate before the mission. The limited pharmacy would need to address the broadest possible range of conditions while fitting within tight mass constraints. Radiation exposure creates additional medical risks beyond medication stability. Acute radiation syndrome could result from solar particle events if shielding proves inadequate. More insidiously, cumulative radiation exposure increases cancer risk and potentially impacts cardiovascular health. The crew physician might need to diagnose and treat conditions directly resulting from the mission environment itself, with limited diagnostic and treatment options. Infection control becomes critically important in the closed environment of a Mars habitat. Any infectious disease could quickly spread through the entire crew in their confined quarters. Meanwhile, the human immune system typically becomes compromised during spaceflight, making infections potentially more severe. The limited antibiotic supply could be quickly exhausted by a persistent infection, and resistant organisms could develop over the mission duration. Maintaining strict hygiene protocols would be essential but challenging given water limitations and the dusty Martian environment. Remote medical guidance from Earth would be severely hampered by communication delays. A physician on Mars describing symptoms to a specialist on Earth might wait 40 minutes for a response to a single question. This makes the interactive diagnostic process we take for granted on Earth essentially impossible. Pre-positioned artificial intelligence diagnostic systems could help bridge this gap, but would still lack the experience and intuition of human specialists. Psychological health monitoring presents unique challenges. Subtle changes in behavior might indicate developing mental health issues, but without the extensive support network available on Earth, intervention options would be limited. The crew would need to function as both healthcare providers and patients for each other, a dual role that creates complex social dynamics in an already stressful environment. Preventive medicine would take on unprecedented importance. Exercise protocols to maintain cardiovascular health, bone density, and muscle mass would require strict adherence. Nutritional monitoring would be essential to prevent deficiencies in the limited diet. Regular health screening could identify developing conditions before they become emergencies, but treatment options for detected problems would remain constrained. Medical evacuation, the standard last resort for remote locations on Earth, simply does not exist for Mars. This fundamental reality means accepting medical risks that would be considered unacceptable in other contexts. It means selecting crew members partially based on their medical history and risk factors. It means training crew members to perform medical procedures far beyond what would typically be expected of non-physicians. And it means developing medical technologies specifically designed for autonomous operation with minimal resupply. Despite these daunting challenges, progress is being made. Advances in telemedicine, point-of-care diagnostics, 3D printing of medical supplies, and autonomous surgical systems all show promise for enhancing medical capabilities on Mars. Artificial intelligence systems could provide diagnostic support beyond what was previously possible in remote environments. These technologies, combined with rigorous crew selection and training, could make Mars medicine feasible despite its unprecedented challenges. The medical risks of Mars exploration, while significant, may ultimately prove manageable through innovation and careful planning, another difficult but potentially surmountable obstacle on humanity's path to becoming a multi-planetary species. The medical challenges of a Mars mission connect directly to another fundamental obstacle: actually getting there. Beyond the medical, psychological, and environmental risks, the sheer technical difficulty of propelling humans safely to Mars and back represents one of the most formidable engineering challenges of interplanetary travel. The distances involved are so vast that our current propulsion technologies stretch to their absolute limits when contemplating human missions to the Red Planet. The basic problem is straightforward to understand but incredibly difficult to solve. Mars, at its closest approach, is still about 35 million miles from Earth, and often much farther. To reach it in a reasonable time frame before radiation exposure, psychological strain, and consumable supplies become critical issues, we need propulsion systems capable of accelerating spacecraft to tremendous speeds and then, crucially, slowing them down again upon arrival. Our current chemical rocket technology, which has served us well for reaching Earth orbit and the Moon, becomes problematic at Martian scales. The fundamental limitation lies in the rocket equation, a mathematical relationship that dictates how much propellant a rocket needs to achieve a certain change in velocity. For Mars missions, the equation becomes almost tyrannical. The vast majority of a spacecraft's initial mass must be propellant rather than useful payload like habitats, supplies, or scientific equipment. This creates a compounding problem. More payload requires more propellant. More propellant requires larger tanks, which themselves become additional mass, requiring even more propellant. This vicious cycle explains why Mars mission designs often involve multiple heavy-lift rocket launches, in-space assembly, and complex staging strategies. The largest rocket currently in development, NASA's Space Launch System, can lift about 130 metric tons to low Earth orbit. Impressive, but still only a fraction of what a comprehensive Mars mission would require. The most efficient trajectories between Earth and Mars, called Hohmann transfer orbits, reduce propellant requirements but impose their own constraints. These trajectories are only available during specific launch windows that occur approximately every 26 months when the planets align properly. Miss this window, and the mission must wait or use significantly more propellant to follow less efficient paths. Even using these optimal trajectories, the journey takes about 7 to 9 months each way, a duration that exacerbates all the radiation, psychological, and life support challenges we've discussed previously. Spacecraft velocity presents another propulsion challenge. A typical Mars-bound spacecraft travels at about 15,000 miles per hour relative to Earth. Upon arrival at Mars, it must shed most of this velocity to enter Martian orbit or descend to the surface. This deceleration requires either massive amounts of propellant for rocket braking, complex aerobraking maneuvers using Mars's thin atmosphere, or some combination of both. For human missions with large habitats and equipment, The size and mass of heat shields for aerobraking become problematic in themselves. The return journey compounds these challenges further. A spacecraft departing Earth carries all its propellant needs, including fuel for the return journey, dramatically increasing initial mass. Alternatively, return propellant could be manufactured on Mars using in situ resource utilization, ISRU, converting Martian carbon dioxide into methane fuel and oxygen. While promising, this approach has never been demonstrated at scale and adds significant complexity and new potential failure points to the mission. More advanced propulsion technologies offer potential solutions but remain largely undeveloped for human-scale missions. Nuclear thermal propulsion, which uses a nuclear reactor to heat propellant rather than chemical combustion, could potentially double efficiency compared to chemical rockets. This technology was extensively tested during the NERVA program in the 1960s and 70s, but never progressed to flight status due to budget constraints and environmental concerns. More exotic technologies like nuclear pulse propulsion, essentially propelling spacecraft with a series of small nuclear explosions, could theoretically achieve even greater performance but face enormous technical, political, and environmental obstacles. Electric propulsion systems, which use electricity to accelerate charged particles to extremely high velocities, offer exceptional efficiency but very low thrust. Current electric propulsion systems like Hall thrusters or ion engines provide gentle acceleration over months or years rather than the powerful initial boost needed to leave Earth's gravity well. They could potentially play a role in cargo missions with flexible arrival times but seem unsuitable as primary propulsion for time-sensitive human missions without significant advancement. Solar sails, magnetic sails, and other exotic propulsion concepts each offer theoretical advantages but remain far from practical implementation for human Mars missions. The reality is that, for the foreseeable future, chemical rockets, perhaps augmented by nuclear thermal technology if political and safety hurdles can be overcome, represent our most viable path to Mars. Even with appropriate propulsion, trajectory planning introduces further complexity. The shortest path to Mars isn't necessarily the safest for humans. Trajectories must balance multiple competing factors, minimizing travel time to reduce radiation exposure and consumables usage, avoiding solar conjunctions that would disrupt communications, arriving at Mars during favourable seasonal conditions, and maintaining abort options when possible during early mission phases. These considerations create a complex optimization problem where no single trajectory satisfies all constraints perfectly. Reliability concerns loom large in propulsion system design, unlike robotic missions where redundancy can be limited to reduce mass. Human missions require exceptional reliability with multiple backup systems, rocket engines and their associated plumbing, valves, and controllers must function perfectly after months or years in the harsh space environment. A propulsion failure during critical maneuvers like Mars orbit insertion could prove fatal, with no possibility of rescue or repair from external sources. The tremendous challenge of propulsion for Mars missions doesn't mean such journeys are impossible, merely that they require exceptional engineering, significant advancement of current technologies, and acceptance of inherent risks. The propulsion technologies we've relied on to reach Earth orbit and the Moon have fundamental limitations when scaled to interplanetary distances. Overcoming these limitations through innovation, improved efficiency, and potentially new propulsion paradigms represents one of the most significant technical hurdles to human Mars exploration, a hurdle that connects directly to every other aspect of mission planning, from life support duration to radiation exposure to psychological well-being. While propulsion systems must work perfectly to get a crew safely to Mars and back, the spacecraft's internal mechanical systems face their own reliability challenges during the years-long mission duration, in the harsh environment of deep space and on the Martian surface. Mechanical failures in critical systems represent one of the most serious and unpredictable threats to mission success and crew survival. Unlike software issues that might be addressed through remote updates, Physical component failures require hands-on repairs with limited spare parts and tools, a daunting prospect millions of miles from Earth. The space environment creates uniquely challenging conditions for mechanical systems. In transit to Mars, spacecraft components experience extreme temperature fluctuations as different surfaces face toward or away from the Sun. A surface in direct sunlight might reach over 250 degrees Fahrenheit, while a surface in shadow simultaneously drops below -250 degrees. These thermal cycles cause materials to expand and contract repeatedly, creating metal fatigue and stress on joints, seals, and moving components. Over a multi-year mission, this cycling can cause microscopic cracks to form and propagate, potentially leading to catastrophic failures. Radiation in deep space further degrades materials, particularly plastics, elastomers, lubricants, and electronic components. Solar and cosmic radiation can break chemical bonds in materials, changing their properties over time in ways that are difficult to predict precisely. Seals become brittle, lubricants break down, plastic components become fragile, and electronic systems experience increasing error rates or complete failures. Unlike the International Space Station, which receives regular resupply missions with replacement parts, a Mars spacecraft must carry all potential spares or have the capability to manufacture them on board. Micrometeoroid impacts, though individually tiny, pose a constant risk to external systems. These natural space projectiles travel at velocities often exceeding 40,000 miles per hour, meaning even a particle the size of a grain of sand carries tremendous energy. Over the long journey to Mars, the statistical probability of impacts on critical external components like radiators, fuel lines, antennas, or solar arrays becomes significant. Shielding adds mass but cannot practically protect all vulnerable systems. The life support system represents perhaps the most critical mechanical assembly on board, with numerous pumps, fans, valves, filters, dot, and processing units that must function continuously. Each component has moving parts subject to wear, contamination, and fatigue. A single failed circulation pump in the thermal control system could cause cascading temperature management problems throughout the spacecraft. A stuck valve in the air revitalization system could lead to dangerous carbon dioxide buildup in crew quarters. The interconnected nature of these systems means that failures rarely remain isolated. They propagate through related systems, potentially escalating from minor issues to life-threatening emergencies with frightening speed. Water management systems face particularly severe reliability challenges. Water is highly corrosive to many materials over long durations, creating problems in storage tanks, transfer lines, purification systems, and reclamation processes. Biological contamination from bacteria and fungi can clog filters, produce biofilms on surfaces, and create health hazards if not properly controlled. The water recovery system on the International Space Station requires significant maintenance and occasional component replacement, a luxury that wouldn't be readily available on a Mars mission without extensive spare parts inventories. Mechanical airlocks, hatches, and seals represent single points of failure with catastrophic consequences if they malfunction. These components must cycle repeatedly during the mission while maintaining perfect pressure integrity. Dust intrusion becomes a severe problem once on the Martian surface, with fine particles working their way into hinge mechanisms, seal interfaces, and bearing assemblies. The combination of dust abrasion and pressure cycling accelerates wear dramatically compared to testing conditions on Earth, potentially leading to premature failures that endanger the entire crew. Power generation introduces another category of potential mechanical failures. Solar arrays must deploy correctly after launch and then survive years of thermal cycling, radiation exposure, and micrometeoroid impacts while continuing to generate reliable power. The tracking mechanisms that keep solar arrays pointed at the sun contain bearings, motors, and actuators that can seize or fail. Radioisotope power systems, if used as alternatives or supplements to solar power, contain moving parts in their cooling systems that must function continuously for years without maintenance. Mobility systems for surface exploration, whether rovers, hoppers, or spacesuits, introduce additional failure points. Wheel assemblies on rovers face extreme challenges in the abrasive Martian soil, with bearings and drive motors operating in dusty conditions at temperature extremes. Spacesuit joints, life support backpacks, and helmet mechanisms must function flawlessly during extravehicular activities where a single failure could be fatal. The difficulty of cleaning and maintaining these systems in the dusty Martian environment accelerates wear far beyond what we experience in Earth testing or even lunar operations. The limited mass budget for Mars missions creates painful trade-offs between redundant systems, spare parts, and repair capabilities. Every kilogram devoted to backup components or tools represents one less kilogram available for scientific equipment, radiation shielding, or consumable supplies. Mission planners must make difficult decisions about which potential failures warrant backup systems or spare parts, and which risks must simply be accepted as unprepared contingencies. Additive manufacturing, commonly known as three-dimensional printing, offers partial solutions to the spare parts dilemma. A capable printer could potentially fabricate replacement components on demand from digital designs, reducing the need to carry every conceivable spare. However, current space-rated printing technology remains limited in the materials it can use, the precision it can achieve, and the structural properties of its output. Metal printing requires significant power and creates potential fire hazards in the oxygen-rich spacecraft environment. While promising, this technology cannot yet reliably produce many critical components like circuit boards, pressure vessels, or precision mechanisms. The human element in mechanical system maintenance introduces its own complexities. Astronauts must become exceptionally skilled generalists, capable of diagnosing and repairing everything from plumbing systems to electronics to life support components. This requires extensive training across multiple engineering disciplines, training that inevitably remains incomplete given the vast array of potential failures. The physical challenges of performing repairs in confined spaces, sometimes while wearing pressurized gloves, adds another layer of difficulty to maintenance operations. Tasks that would be straightforward on Earth become enormously challenging in space or on Mars. Despite these daunting challenges, history has shown that well-trained crews can perform remarkable feats of improvised repair in crisis situations. The Apollo 13 mission's famous carbon dioxide scrubber modification, building an adapter from spare parts to make square filters work in round receptacles, demonstrates how human ingenuity can overcome mechanical failures when no other options exist. For Mars missions, this capacity for creative problem-solving represents a critical advantage over purely robotic missions. But it cannot eliminate the fundamental vulnerability to mechanical failures in critical systems across years of continuous operation in one of the most hostile environments humans have ever attempted to explore. The unpredictable nature of mechanical failures in space leads us to another critical challenge astronauts would face after finally reaching Mars: the physical struggle of adapting to gravity again after months in weightlessness. This transition represents a dangerous period when crew members would be physically compromised precisely when they need to be at their most capable. After spending 6 to 9 months floating freely during transit to Mars, the human body undergoes profound changes that don't simply reverse the moment gravity returns. The gravity on Mars, about 38% of Earth's, might seem like a gentle reintroduction compared to returning directly to our home planet. However, even this reduced gravitational force would create significant physical challenges for newly arrived astronauts. The most immediate and visible effect would be difficulty with basic movement and balance. Astronauts returning to Earth from the International Space Station often struggle to walk in a straight line, maintain balance with eyes closed, or even stand upright without assistance for the first few days. On Mars, These effects would be less severe, but still significant, potentially limiting crew productivity during the critical early days of surface operations. The cardiovascular system faces particularly dramatic challenges during gravity transition. In microgravity, blood and bodily fluids shift upward, causing the characteristic puffy faces and thin legs seen in space travelers. The heart adapts to this fluid redistribution by reducing in size and changing its pumping characteristics. When gravity returns, blood rushes back to the lower extremities, but the deconditioned cardiovascular system struggles to maintain adequate blood pressure to the brain. This can result in orthostatic intolerance, the inability to stand without feeling dizzy or fainting. For Mars explorers, this could mean being confined to seated or reclined positions during early surface operations, severely limiting their ability to set up equipment, explore the landing site, or respond to emergencies. Bone density loss represents another serious concern. Studies from the International Space Station show astronauts lose approximately 1 to 2% of bone mineral density per month in key weight-bearing areas like the spine, hips, and legs, even with rigorous exercise protocols. This bone loss continues throughout extended missions. Upon arrival at Mars after a 7-month journey, astronauts might have lost 7 to 14% of their bone density, approaching the clinical definition of osteoporosis. This weakened skeletal structure faces immediate stress when exposed to Martian gravity, creating risk of fractures during normal movement or minor falls. Since bone regeneration occurs slowly, this vulnerability would persist throughout the surface mission. Muscle atrophy parallels bone loss during spaceflight. Without the constant work of opposing Earth's gravity, muscles rapidly decrease in size, strength, and endurance. The most affected areas are the postural muscles of the back, neck, and legs, precisely those needed for standing and moving in gravity. Current exercise protocols on the International Space Station help mitigate but don't prevent this deconditioning. Mars astronauts would experience reduced strength and endurance, making physical labour more difficult and exhausting. Activities as simple as carrying equipment or climbing into a rover could become challenging, especially when combined with the awkwardness of working in pressurized spacesuits. The neurovestibular system, responsible for balance, spatial orientation, and coordination, undergoes significant recalibration in microgravity. Without the constant reference of down, the brain adapts to using visual cues and touch sensations for orientation. When gravity returns, this recalibrated system must readjust again, leading to motion sickness, disorientation, and difficulty coordinating movements. Astronauts on Mars would likely experience impaired hand-eye coordination, affecting their ability to operate equipment precisely or perform delicate tasks. These effects might persist for days or even weeks, complicating early surface operations. Fine motor control suffers similarly during gravitational transition. Tasks requiring precise finger movements, like adjusting scientific instruments, repairing equipment, or even operating computer interfaces, become more difficult as the brain relearns how objects behave in gravity. The weight of one's arms and hands, nearly forgotten during months in microgravity, suddenly becomes a factor in every movement. This readjustment period creates potential for errors or accidents during critical early mission phases. Sleep disruption often accompanies gravity transitions, compounding physical difficulties with cognitive impairment. The body's circadian rhythm, already challenged by the artificial day-night cycles of spaceflight, faces further disruption when gravitational cues return. Many astronauts report difficulty sleeping during their first days back in gravity, precisely when rest is most needed for physical recovery. Mars astronauts might face extended periods of poor sleep quality, affecting decision-making, reaction time, and emotional regulation during the demanding early surface operations. The visual system experiences its own readaptation challenges. In microgravity, Fluid shifts affect eye shape and intraocular pressure, sometimes causing lasting vision changes. Upon return to gravity, these effects begin to reverse, but not immediately. Astronauts might experience changing visual acuity or focal distances during the transition period, requiring frequent adjustments to corrective lenses or creating safety issues when depth perception is critical. Immune function, already compromised during spaceflight, faces additional stress during gravitational transition as the body reallocates resources to adapting major physiological systems. This temporary suppression comes at a particularly inconvenient time when astronauts are first exposed to whatever microorganisms might exist in their new Martian habitat, plus any that developed in spacecraft systems during transit. This creates elevated infection risk during early surface operations. The combination of these physical challenges creates a dangerous vulnerability period precisely when mission risk is already elevated due to arrival and setup operations. The current mitigation strategy involves extensive exercise during transit, typically 2 to 3 hours daily using specialized resistance devices and treadmills with bungee systems. While helpful, even the best current countermeasures cannot completely prevent deconditioning. Pharmaceutical interventions to preserve bone and muscle mass show promise, but carry their own side effect risks during long-duration missions. Some mission architectures propose artificial gravity during transit, either by spinning the entire spacecraft or providing a centrifuge compartment where crew members could spend time each day. This approach theoretically prevents many microgravity effects, but introduces significant engineering challenges in spacecraft design, propulsion requirements, and potential motion sickness from Coriolis effects in small radius systems. The mass and complexity penalties of artificial gravity systems must be weighed against their physiological benefits. The Martian gravity itself presents an unknown in space medicine. While we have extensive data on human physiology in Earth's gravity and in microgravity, we have no direct experience with how the human body responds to partial gravity environments over extended periods. It's possible that Mars gravity is sufficient to maintain some degree of physiological conditioning, slowing or halting the degeneration seen in microgravity. Alternatively, it might merely slow the rate of deconditioning while introducing unique partial gravity adaptations we haven't yet identified. Despite these significant challenges, the human body demonstrates remarkable adaptability. With proper preparation, careful activity planning during the transition period, and appropriate medical support, astronauts would likely overcome these gravitational readaptation issues. However, mission planners must account for a potentially extended period of reduced physical capability upon Mars arrival, a vulnerability window that could last days or weeks during which the crew might need to rely heavily on automated systems or robotic assistance until their Earth-evolved bodies adapt to their new gravitational reality. Once astronauts have adapted to Martian gravity and established their surface habitat, the challenge of feeding themselves for potentially years becomes paramount. Sustainable food production represents one of the most fundamental but difficult aspects of long-duration Mars missions. Unlike water or oxygen, which can be recycled with relatively compact systems, food production requires significant space, energy, and resources, all precious commodities on a Mars mission. Current space missions rely primarily on pre-packaged foods with shelf lives of approximately 1.5 to 5 years, depending on the specific item. These foods are carefully developed to provide balanced nutrition while minimizing mass and volume. However, a Mars mission lasting 3 years or more pushes beyond these shelf life limits. Over time, vitamins degrade, textures change, and palatability decreases. Nutritional deficiencies could develop if astronauts consumed exclusively aged pre-packaged foods, potentially affecting crew health and performance. Beyond nutrition, the psychological importance of food cannot be overstated. In isolated, confined environments like a Mars habitat, meals become crucial social occasions and psychological anchors. Fresh food provides sensory variety through taste, texture, dot, aroma, and appearance, sensory inputs that would be severely limited in the otherwise unchanging habitat environment. The ability to grow even small amounts of fresh produce could significantly impact crew morale and psychological well-being during years of isolation. Growing food on Mars introduces complex engineering challenges. Plants require significant space, a precious commodity in spacecraft design where every cubic foot must be justified against competing needs. Light represents another critical resource, as plants typically need 12 to 16 hours of proper spectrum illumination daily. While LED technology has improved efficiency, lighting for plant growth still consumes substantial electrical power that must be generated by limited solar panels or nuclear sources. Water usage for agriculture creates another constraint. Plants transpire most of the water they absorb, releasing it as humidity that must be recaptured by the habitat's environmental control systems. While theoretically efficient in a closed system, this creates additional load on humidity control, condensation systems, and water purification processes. Any leakage in this water cycle could endanger the entire mission's water budget. Plant growth in reduced gravity environments presents unique challenges we're still working to understand. Experiments on the International Space Station have demonstrated that plants can grow in microgravity, but they often develop differently than their Earth counterparts. Root systems orient differently. Fluid dynamics within plant tissues change, and nutrient uptake may be affected. Mars's partial gravity likely provides improvement over microgravity conditions, but Earth-evolved plants may still require adaptations or special growing configurations to thrive. The growing medium for plants presents another challenge. Traditional soil is heavy and impractical to transport from Earth in quantity. Hydroponic systems using nutrient solutions without soil offer one alternative, but they require careful monitoring and control of solution chemistry. Aeroponic systems, where plant roots are suspended in air and misted with nutrient solution, provide even greater efficiency but with increased complexity and potential failure points. Some proposals suggest using processed Martian regolith as a growing medium, but this would require removing perchlorates and other toxic compounds before it could safely support Earth plants. Plant selection must balance nutritional density, growth rate, resource efficiency, and psychological benefit. Leafy greens like lettuce and spinach grow quickly with relatively low resource requirements, providing essential vitamins and welcome fresh texture, but offer minimal calories. Root crops like potatoes provide more caloric density, but require greater growing volume and longer growing cycles. Fruit-bearing plants like tomatoes or strawberries offer tremendous psychological benefits, but typically demand more resources per calorie than staple crops. The optimal mix would likely include fast-growing greens for regular harvest, complemented by strategic plantings of higher-calorie crops and occasional morale-boosting fruits. Microbiological management becomes critical in closed-system agriculture. Plants and their growing media create ideal environments for bacteria and fungi, which can potentially spread throughout the habitat. Beneficial microorganisms are essential for plant health, while harmful ones could contaminate food, cause plant diseases, or create health risks for the crew. Maintaining this microbiological balance without traditional agricultural inputs like fresh soil or beneficial insect populations represents a significant challenge. Sterilization techniques must be balanced against the need for healthy microbial environments around plant roots. Pollination presents unique challenges in a closed habitat without natural pollinators. Wind-pollinated plants like wheat might adapt well, but many fruits and vegetables require insect pollination on Earth. Mars gardeners would need to hand-pollinate these crops, or potentially establish tiny populations of pollinators like bees, creating yet another biological system to maintain within the habitat. Self-pollinating crop varieties offer advantages in this environment but may limit genetic diversity over multiple generations. Time and labour requirements cannot be overlooked. Gardening activities, planting, tending, harvesting, processing require significant crew time. While these activities might provide welcome psychological benefits as a break from technical work, they represent a labour investment that must be balanced against other mission priorities. Automation could reduce this burden, but adds complexity and potential failure points to an already challenging system. Despite these challenges, progress continues in developing space agriculture capabilities. Experiments aboard the International Space Station have successfully grown various vegetables in microgravity. The vegetable production system, nicknamed Veggie, has produced multiple crops of lettuce, radishes, and other vegetables that astronauts have harvested and eaten. These small-scale successes provide valuable data, but represent only the beginning of what would be needed for substantial food production on Mars. Ultimately, early Mars missions would likely employ a hybrid approach to food, bringing substantial supplies of shelf-stable, pre-packaged foods supplemented by fresh produce grown in carefully designed habitat gardens. This fresh component might provide only 10 to 20% of caloric needs, but could deliver critical nutrients and psychological benefits. As technologies mature and experience grows, the proportion of locally grown food could gradually increase in subsequent missions, moving toward the greater self-sufficiency that would be essential for sustainable human presence on the Red Planet. While complete food independence remains a distant goal, even partial food production would significantly enhance mission resilience, crew health, and the psychological well-being necessary for humans to thrive millions of miles from the farms of Earth. Food production and sustainable agriculture represent just one part of a larger challenge in Mars missions, managing all vital resources in a closed system. Among these resources, water stands as perhaps the most critical and complex to manage. The cycle of water usage, purification, and reuse forms the lifeblood of any Mars mission, where every drop must be accounted for and preserved in a system thousands of times smaller than Earth's natural water cycle. Water's importance on a Mars mission extends far beyond drinking. It's essential for food preparation, personal hygiene, medical needs, scientific experiments, potential crop growth, oxygen generation through electrolysis, and as a component in various chemical processes. A single astronaut typically requires about 2 to 4 litres of drinking water daily, but when all uses are considered, that figure rises to approximately 50 litres per person per day in minimal usage scenarios. For a crew of 6 on a 3-year mission, this would total over 300,000 litres, a mass of 300 metric tons if carried entirely from Earth, which is completely impractical given launch constraints. The solution lies in creating a closed-loop water recovery system with efficiency approaching 100%, far beyond what we've achieved in space to date. The water recovery system on the International Space Station currently reclaims about 90% of water, an impressive figure but still insufficient for Mars missions. That missing 10% would require significant resupply from Earth, which won't be possible once astronauts are on Mars. Achieving near-perfect recycling efficiency represents an enormous technical challenge that affects the fundamental viability of long-duration Mars habitation. The complexity of water recycling lies in the diverse sources that must be processed. Urine contains high concentrations of salts, urea, and other compounds that must be removed through distillation, filtration, and chemical processing. Humidity condensed from the air carries skin cells, exhaled metabolites, and microorganisms. Hygiene water contains soaps, skin oils, hair, and various biological materials. Food preparation water includes organic compounds, particles, and potential microbial contamination. Each source requires specific treatment approaches, creating a multi-stage purification system with numerous potential failure points. Current spacecraft water recovery technology combines physical filtration, chemical treatment, and distillation processes. Physical filters remove particles of various sizes, from large debris down to microbial cells. Ion exchange resins remove dissolved salts and organic compounds. distillation separates water from contaminants through phase change, often using vacuum to lower the boiling point and save energy. Catalytic oxidation systems break down complex organic compounds that resist other treatment methods. Finally, iodine or silver is typically added as a biocide to prevent microbial growth during storage. The energy requirements for water processing are substantial. Distillation particularly demands significant thermal energy to achieve phase change. While heat recuperation systems can improve efficiency, water purification remains one of the larger power consumers in a habitat's life support system. Power limitations on Mars, where solar energy is less than half as intense as on Earth, create pressure to develop increasingly energy-efficient water recovery technologies. Monitoring water quality presents another challenge. Contamination that goes undetected could lead to illness or long-term health effects for the crew. Earth-based water quality labs use sophisticated equipment and trained technicians to identify biological, chemical, and physical contaminants, resources that would be severely limited on Mars. Compact, reliable sensors capable of detecting multiple contaminant types would be essential, yet must function for years without calibration or replacement. The consequences of sensor failure could be severe if contaminated water were incorrectly identified as safe. Microbial control within water systems becomes increasingly difficult during extended missions. Bacteria and fungi inevitably enter water recycling systems and can form biofilms, surface-attached communities protected by secreted polymers that resist normal disinfection methods. These biofilms not only harbour potentially pathogenic organisms, but can also clog filters, corrode pipes, and degrade system performance. The International Space Station has experienced biofilm issues requiring maintenance or component replacement, interventions that would be much more difficult on Mars with limited spare parts. Storage of water introduces additional challenges. Water is heavy, about 8 pounds per gallon, making storage tanks massive components of life support systems. Yet sufficient reserve capacity is essential to buffer against system failures or maintenance periods. Water in storage for extended periods may develop microbial growth or leach compounds from container materials. Freezing must be prevented, requiring either insulation and heating in cold areas of the habitat or chemical additives that themselves may require subsequent removal. The psychological aspect of water recycling cannot be overlooked. While astronauts intellectually understand the necessity of water reuse, the concept of drinking water processed from urine, sweat, and other waste sources creates unavoidable psychological resistance. Systems must not only function technically, but must also produce water that looks, smells, and tastes pure to maintain crew acceptance. This psychological barrier becomes more significant during long-duration missions where alternatives don't exist. Contingency planning for water system failures becomes critically important. A complete failure of water purification capability could become life-threatening within days. Backup systems, emergency water reserves, and repair capabilities must be incorporated into mission planning, adding mass and complexity to an already challenging system design. The ability to isolate and bypass damaged system components while maintaining partial functionality could mean the difference between a manageable repair situation and a mission-ending emergency. In situ water utilization offers potential relief to these challenges. Evidence suggests subsurface water ice exists in many regions of Mars, particularly at mid to high latitudes. Accessing this ice, melting it, and purifying it for crew use could dramatically reduce dependency on closed-loop recycling. However, extracting ice from beneath the Martian surface requires heavy equipment, significant energy, and introduces new engineering challenges. The ice may also contain perchlorates and other Martian contaminants requiring removal before use. Despite these challenges, local water resources could eventually become essential for sustainable human presence on Mars. The technologies developed for Mars water recycling have significant applications on Earth, where water scarcity affects billions of people. highly efficient. Low-energy water purification systems could revolutionize disaster response, remote community infrastructure, and urban water management in drought-prone regions. This Earth benefit aspect helps justify the considerable investment required to develop nearly perfect water recycling capabilities for Mars missions. Through careful system design, redundancy, monitoring, and potentially in-situ resource utilization, a sustainable water cycle can be maintained on Mars. However, the margins for error remain slim, and the consequences of failure severe. Water management exemplifies the fundamental challenge of Mars exploration, creating and maintaining artificial versions of Earth's natural systems on a smaller scale, with limited resources, in an environment fundamentally hostile to human life. While ensuring a reliable water supply ranks among the top priorities for Mars missions, another significant concern lurks within the very ground beneath astronauts' feet. The Martian soil itself poses unique dangers to both human health and equipment through its unusual chemistry, physical properties, and behavior. What looks like ordinary reddish dirt harbors a complex mixture of compounds formed through billions of years of unusual geological processes and radiation exposure, creating a material that could significantly complicate human exploration. Perhaps the most concerning component of Martian soil is perchlorates, chlorine-based compounds that have been detected at surprisingly high concentrations by multiple Mars rovers and landers. The Phoenix lander found perchlorate levels as high as 0.6% by weight in some samples, about 10,000 times higher than typical concentrations in Earth soils. These compounds, while relatively benign in the cold, dry Martian environment, become problematic when brought into contact with humans or warm, moist habitats. Perchlorates affect human health in several significant ways. They interfere with iodine uptake by the thyroid gland, potentially causing hypothyroidism with symptoms including fatigue, cold sensitivity, and cognitive impairment. Perchlorates can also cause lung irritation, skin rashes upon contact, and digestive issues if ingested. Long-term exposure has been linked to developmental problems and potential reproductive issues. These health effects would be particularly dangerous during a Mars mission, where medical care is limited and crew performance is critical. The risk comes primarily from dust infiltration into habitats. Even the best-designed airlocks and decontamination procedures cannot completely prevent the ultrafine Martian dust from entering living spaces. Over a mission lasting years, this dust would accumulate in filters, surfaces, and potentially the astronauts' lungs if airborne. Testing with simulated Martian soil shows that its physical properties make it particularly difficult to control. It clings to surfaces due to electrostatic charging and can pass through smaller gaps than typical Earth dust due to its fine particle size. Beyond perchlorates, the highly oxidizing nature of Martian soil presents challenges for equipment and materials. This oxidizing characteristic comes from compounds formed through long-term radiation exposure and the unique chemical weathering processes on Mars. When these compounds encounter water, even the tiny amounts present in human breath or skin moisture, they can become chemically active. Materials like rubber seals, certain plastics, and fabrics can degrade more quickly when exposed to these oxidants, potentially compromising spacesuits, tools, and habitat components over time. The physical structure of Martian dust compounds these chemical concerns. Unlike Earth dust, which has been worn down by water and biological processes over millions of years, Martian dust particles retain sharp, jagged edges. Under microscopic examination, these particles look more like tiny shards of glass than rounded Earth soil particles. This abrasive quality means Martian dust can cause physical wear on moving parts, seal interfaces, and potentially respiratory tissue if inhaled. The combination of chemical reactivity and physical abrasiveness makes Martian dust particularly dangerous to both mechanical systems and human health. Radiation exposure has also altered Martian surface materials in ways not seen on Earth. Billions of years of cosmic and solar radiation without the protection of a substantial atmosphere has created unusual chemical compounds and potentially reactive free radicals within the soil. Some researchers suggest these compounds could generate harmful reactive oxygen species when combined with water, potentially causing cellular damage similar to radiation exposure if they enter the human body. Heavy metals represent another potential concern in Martian soil. Analysis by Mars rovers has detected various metal elements including lead, arsenic, cadmium, and chromium, while their concentrations and chemical forms remain incompletely understood. Long-term exposure to dust containing these elements could potentially lead to accumulation in the body and associated toxicity. The limited medical diagnostic and treatment capabilities available during a Mars mission would make detecting and addressing heavy metal poisoning particularly challenging. Managing these risks would require multiple protective strategies. Habitat design would need to incorporate advanced airlock systems with dust mitigation technologies far beyond those used on the International Space Station. These might include electrostatic precipitation to capture charged dust particles, specialized airflow patterns to direct contamination away from living areas, and possibly liquid-based decontamination systems for spacesuits and equipment returning from surface activities. Personal protective equipment would form another critical defense layer. Spacesuits for Mars exploration would need to resist dust penetration while remaining flexible enough for practical work. Inside habitats. Astronauts might need to wear filtration masks during high-risk activities or following potential dust intrusion events. Medical protocols would include regular monitoring for perchlorate exposure and respiratory health, with countermeasures like iodine supplementation potentially necessary to offset thyroid effects. Psychological aspects of dust management add another dimension to the challenge. Constant vigilance against invisible chemical threats creates mental strain, while visible dust accumulation in living spaces could generate anxiety about contamination. Balancing necessary precautions against the psychological burden of constant threat awareness would be essential for maintaining crew well-being during extended missions. Scientific understanding of these risks continues to evolve as we gather more data from Mars missions. The Perseverance rover, currently exploring Jezero crater, carries instruments that provide more detailed soil composition analysis than previous missions. Sample return missions planned for the coming decade will allow the first comprehensive laboratory analysis of Martian soil on Earth, potentially revealing both additional hazards and mitigation strategies before humans arrive. Despite these challenges, the risks from Martian soil appear manageable with proper precautions. Apollo astronauts encountered somewhat similar issues with lunar dust, reporting irritation and equipment problems, yet completed their missions successfully. The Mars challenge is greater due to the chemical composition of the soil and the much longer mission duration, but engineering solutions exist for most identified hazards. Ultimately, Martian soil represents another example of how Mars exploration requires rethinking assumptions based on Earth experience. What looks familiar, simple reddish soil, harbours alien characteristics shaped by billions of years of different planetary processes. Understanding and managing these differences will be critical to protecting both astronaut health and mission equipment during humanity's first journeys to the Red Planet. While not an insurmountable obstacle, the toxic potential of Martian soil adds another layer of complexity to an already enormously challenging endeavour. While the chemical composition of Martian soil presents significant health concerns, the extreme temperature environment of Mars creates an equally formidable challenge for human exploration. The temperature regime on the Red Planet differs from Earth in ways that fundamentally impact habitat design, equipment operation, and even basic survival. Mars experiences temperature swings far more dramatic than most places on Earth, creating a constantly shifting thermal environment that stresses both technology and human physiology. The average temperature on Mars hovers around -60 degrees Celsius, significantly colder than Antarctica's average. However, this average masks the extreme variations that make Mars particularly challenging. At the equator during summer, Daytime temperatures might reach a relatively mild 20 degrees Celsius, similar to a pleasant spring day on Earth. Yet just hours later, after sunset, those same locations can plummet to minus 70 degrees Celsius or lower. This daily temperature swing of 90 degrees or more exceeds anything regularly experienced on Earth, where even the harshest deserts rarely see daily variations greater than 40 degrees. This extreme cycling occurs primarily because of Mars' thin atmosphere, which contains less than 1% the pressure of Earth's atmosphere. This wispy layer of mostly carbon dioxide provides minimal thermal insulation, allowing heat to escape rapidly when direct sunlight isn't present. The atmosphere is too thin to effectively transport heat from warmer to cooler areas, meaning that shadows can be dramatically colder than sunlit areas just meters away. Spacecraft thermal images of the Martian surface often show stark boundaries between sun and shadow. With temperature differences of 50 degrees or more across these lines, seasonal variations compound these daily cycles. Mars has a similar axial tilt to Earth, creating seasons, but its more elliptical orbit makes these seasons of unequal length. The southern hemisphere experiences particularly extreme conditions, with summers that are shorter but warmer and winters that are longer and colder than in the northern hemisphere. At the poles, temperatures can drop to minus 150 degrees Celsius during winter as carbon dioxide freezes directly from the atmosphere to form seasonal dry ice caps. These temperature extremes create multiple engineering challenges for Mars missions. Any structure or vehicle must withstand not just the absolute temperature limits, but also the constant cycling between hot and cold. This thermal cycling causes materials to expand and contract repeatedly, creating mechanical stress that leads to fatigue and eventual failure. Joints, seals, and interfaces between different materials are particularly vulnerable as uneven expansion rates create gaps or excessive pressure. Electronics designed for Earth's temperature ranges may fail when subjected to Martian extremes, requiring special components or protective thermal management systems. Battery performance degrades significantly in extreme cold, creating power management challenges for vehicles and equipment operating away from heated habitats. The Martian rovers have dealt with this by incorporating radioisotope heating units, or, in the case of solar-powered rovers, severely restricting operations during cold periods and directing available power to survival heating rather than scientific instruments. Human missions would require far more robust power and heating solutions to maintain life support systems through the cold Martian nights and potential dust storms. Maintaining a habitable temperature inside Mars structures requires sophisticated thermal management systems that must function reliably for years. Habitats need substantial insulation to retain heat, yet must also be able to reject excess heat during the day or when internal activities generate thermal loads. The day-night cycling means these systems must transition between heating and cooling modes daily, creating complex control challenges. The lack of flowing water on Mars eliminates the possibility of using water-based heat rejection systems common on Earth, forcing reliance on radiative cooling or more complex refrigeration cycles. Spacesuit design for Martian extravehicular activities, EVAs, faces particularly difficult thermal challenges. The suit must protect against extreme cold while also preventing overheating during physical activity. In the thin Martian atmosphere, conventional convective cooling doesn't work effectively, so suits must rely on radiation or sublimation cooling systems. The suit must also maintain even temperature distribution across the body, preventing a situation where an astronaut's sun-facing side overheats while their shadowed side freezes. This becomes especially challenging during stationary tasks where natural body movement doesn't help distribute heat. The human body itself responds poorly to extreme temperatures. Cold exposure reduces dexterity, slows cognitive processing, and ultimately leads to hypothermia if core temperature drops significantly. Heat stress reduces physical endurance, increases water requirements, and can progress to heat exhaustion or heat stroke, while the habitat environment would be carefully controlled. Any failure of thermal systems could quickly create life-threatening conditions. Emergency protocols would need to account for rapid temperature changes if habitat integrity were compromised. Mechanical systems face additional challenges in the Martian temperature environment. Lubricants designed for Earth conditions may freeze or lose effectiveness at Martian temperature extremes. Moving parts must maintain proper clearances despite thermal expansion and contraction. Pressurized systems for water, air, or propellants must prevent freezing that could rupture containers or block critical flow paths. Even simple tasks like drilling or hammering become complicated when materials behave differently at extreme temperatures, becoming brittle when cold or losing strength when heated. Perhaps the most insidious thermal challenge comes from dust storms. When global storms envelop the planet, they alter the thermal environment dramatically. Surface temperatures become more moderate but also more uniform. The dust blocks direct sunlight, reducing daytime heating, but also traps infrared radiation, preventing nighttime cooling. This disruption of normal thermal patterns can last weeks or months, potentially pushing habitat systems designed for typical cycles beyond their operational parameters. Solar panels become less effective during these periods, precisely when heating demands may increase due to reduced direct solar heating of structures. The combination of extreme cold, dramatic cycling, seasonal variations, and dust storm effects creates a thermal environment unlike anything we manage on Earth. Even polar research stations, while dealing with extreme cold, don't experience the daily temperature swings or atmospheric conditions of Mars. The thermal challenge permeates every aspect of Mars mission design, affecting everything from material selection to power systems to daily operational schedules. Overcoming these challenges requires robust, redundant systems with significant margins for degradation over time, adding mass, complexity, and cost to already challenging mission requirements. The extreme temperature environment of Mars directly impacts one of the most fundamental requirements for human survival: shelter. Constructing and maintaining habitable structures on the Martian surface represents a unique engineering challenge that combines the difficulties of spacecraft design, architecture, and frontier construction under alien conditions. Unlike temporary shelters used for exploration on Earth, Martian habitats must function as spacecraft, laboratories, homes, and protection from a lethal environment, all with minimal maintenance from Earth for years at a time. The basic requirements for a Mars habitat start with pressure containment. Mars's atmospheric pressure averages about 6 millibars, less than 1% of Earth's sea level pressure. This means habitats must be essentially spacecraft, maintaining internal pressure against near vacuum conditions. This pressure differential places enormous stress on structures. A typical habitat module with a 5-meter diameter experiences about 50 tons of force trying to burst it outward. Any failure in this pressure shell would be catastrophic, potentially causing rapid decompression and death for the inhabitants. This pressure requirement fundamentally shapes habitat design. Spheres and cylinders naturally distribute pressure stresses most efficiently, which is why most Mars habitat concepts feature these shapes rather than the rectangular rooms we're accustomed to on Earth. Construction materials must withstand not just the constant stress of pressure containment, but also tens of thousands of pressure cycles as airlocks operate over the mission duration. Joints, seams, and penetrations for electrical, communication, and life support systems create potential failure points that require careful design and redundant sealing systems. Radiation protection represents another critical habitat requirement. Without Earth's protective magnetic field and thick atmosphere, Mars's surface receives radiation levels that would quickly exceed safety limits for astronauts. Habitat walls must incorporate radiation shielding, which typically means mass, lots of it, water, hydrogen-rich plastics, or regolith, Martian soil, can provide effective shielding. But adding this protection significantly increases structural requirements. One promising approach uses local resources by piling Martian soil on top of habitats or placing them in natural formations like lava tubes to provide shielding without launching massive shields from Earth. Thermal management, as discussed earlier, creates another design challenge. Habitats must maintain comfortable internal temperatures despite external variations of over 100 degrees Celsius. This requires sophisticated insulation systems that work under pressure differential conditions. Traditional building insulation would be compressed by the pressure difference, losing effectiveness. The habitat must also manage internal heat generation from equipment and human metabolism, rejecting excess heat through radiators that work in the thin Martian atmosphere where convective cooling is minimal. Micrometeoroid protection adds another layer of design requirements. While large meteorite impacts are relatively rare, micrometeoroid impacts occur regularly on Mars due to its thin atmosphere providing minimal protection. These tiny, high-velocity particles can penetrate unprotected structures, causing slow leaks or damaging external equipment. Habitat designs typically incorporate micrometeoroid shields, sacrificial layers designed to absorb impacts before they reach pressure-critical components. Construction methods for Mars habitats fall into several categories, each with advantages and challenges. Pre-integrated habitats launched fully assembled from Earth offer reliability and Earth-based quality control but severely limit size due to launch vehicle constraints. Inflatable structures can pack more compactly for launch but raise concerns about puncture resistance and long-term material degradation. In situ resource utilization approaches propose using Martian materials to build structures, potentially enabling much larger habitats but requiring complex processing equipment and unproven construction techniques in the Martian environment. Regardless of the basic construction approach, all Mars habitats must address the same functional requirements. Airlocks serve as the critical transition between the lethal external environment and the habitable interior. These complex mechanisms must cycle efficiently to minimize air loss while effectively removing dust and contaminants from returning astronauts and equipment. Each airlock cycle loses a small amount of atmosphere, creating a cumulative resource drain that must be accounted for in life support planning. Interior layout must balance efficient use of limited space with psychological considerations for long-duration habitation. Private spaces for sleep and personal activities must coexist with common areas for dining, exercise, work, and recreation. Noise management becomes surprisingly important in confined habitats, as constant sounds from life support equipment can create psychological stress and sleep disruption. Interior materials must control odors, resist microbial growth, and withstand years of use without replacement. Furniture and fixtures must function in Martian gravity, about 38% of Earth's, where familiar designs may become unstable or awkward to use. Maintenance access represents a critical but often overlooked aspect of habitat design. Life support systems, electrical components, plumbing, and communication equipment all require regular maintenance and occasional repairs. Habitat designs must provide access to these systems without compromising structural integrity or radiation protection. Modular approaches allow for component replacement, but create more seams and connections that themselves become potential failure points. The balance between accessibility and reliability represents one of the most challenging aspects of long-duration habitat design. Dust mitigation becomes a daily maintenance concern once the habitat is operational on Mars. As discussed previously, Martian dust possesses properties that make it particularly problematic. It's fine, electrostatically charged, and potentially toxic. Habitats must incorporate specialized filtration systems, surface treatments that resist dust adhesion, and cleaning protocols that prevent accumulation in critical systems. The airlock design must minimize dust entry while allowing frequent use, possibly incorporating staged cleaning processes or electrostatic removal systems. Psychological factors significantly influence habitat design beyond mere survival requirements. Extended confinement in a limited space affects mental well-being, making design elements like ceiling height, color schemes, lighting quality, and window placement more important than they might seem initially. Views of the Martian landscape provide crucial psychological connection to the surrounding environment and mission purpose. Yet each window represents a structural weakness and radiation pathway that must be carefully engineered. Virtual windows using external cameras and displays offer an alternative, but lack the psychological impact of direct visual connection to the outside world. Habitat resilience against partial failures becomes a design priority for Mars missions. Unlike the International Space Station, which can be abandoned in emergencies with crew returning to Earth within hours, Mars habitats must continue functioning even after significant system failures. This drives requirements for isolation capability between habitat sections, redundant life support zones, and emergency protocols that can sustain crew survival in degraded modes for extended periods until repairs can be completed. The cumulative challenge of Mars habitat design integrates multiple engineering disciplines with human factors science and practical construction limitations. The structure must function simultaneously as spacecraft, radiation shelter, thermal refuge, and psychological home, maintaining these functions reliably for years with minimal support from Earth and limited repair resources. While formidable, these challenges have sparked innovative design approaches that continue to evolve as our understanding of Mars conditions improves and our experience with long-duration space habitation grows. The habitats that eventually house the first Martian explorers will represent some of the most sophisticated structures ever created, artificial environments that enable human life to survive and potentially thrive in one of the most hostile environments we've ever attempted to inhabit. Beyond the immense technical challenges of designing and building habitats on Mars lies perhaps an even greater obstacle: the staggering economic cost of human Mars missions. The financial reality of sending people to the Red Planet represents one of the most significant barriers to turning technical possibilities into actual missions. When discussing Mars exploration, the conversation inevitably turns to dollars, euros, or yuan, and the figures involved are truly astronomical. Estimating the total cost of a human Mars mission involves substantial uncertainty. But most serious studies place the price tag somewhere between $100 billion and $1 trillion for a comprehensive program. For perspective, the entire Apollo program cost approximately $150 billion in today's money and only required reaching a destination 3 days away rather than 7 months. The International Space Station, humanity's most expensive single structure, has cost roughly $100 billion over its lifetime, and that's in low Earth orbit, just 400 kilometers above our planet. This enormous expense stems from the complexity and scale of what's required. A Mars mission isn't a single spacecraft, but an entire system of systems: heavy lift launch vehicles, transit habitats, landing systems, surface habitats, power generation equipment, resource utilization technologies, life support systems, surface mobility, scientific equipment, and Earth return vehicles. Each component must be developed, tested, qualified for space, manufactured, and integrated into the overall architecture. The development costs alone for these specialized systems would consume billions before the first hardware ever leaves Earth. Launch costs, while declining thanks to companies like SpaceX, remain a major expense. A human Mars mission would require multiple heavy lift launches to place all necessary components in Earth orbit for assembly. Even at SpaceX's relatively low costs of approximately $1,500 per kilogram to low Earth orbit with their Falcon Heavy rocket, launching the estimated 500 to 1,000 metric tons of equipment needed would cost billions just in launch services. More advanced rockets like NASA's Space Launch System or SpaceX's Starship may eventually reduce these costs. But development of these vehicles themselves represents massive investment. The extended timeline of Mars mission development creates financial challenges beyond the raw numbers. Space programs typically operate on annual government appropriations that can fluctuate with changing political priorities, economic conditions, and administrative changes. A Mars program might require sustained funding over 15 to 20 years from initial development through mission completion, spanning multiple presidential administrations, congressional sessions, or parliamentary terms. This political discontinuity creates program vulnerability, as seen with previous cancelled NASA initiatives like the Constellation program. International partnerships offer one approach to distributing costs, similar to the International Space Station model where costs and responsibilities are shared among participating nations. However, international projects introduce coordination complexity, technology transfer issues, and potential schedule impacts when partner contributions face delays. The geopolitical landscape can also shift significantly during a decades-long development program, potentially threatening carefully negotiated agreements. Private sector involvement has emerged as another potential solution to the cost challenge. Companies like SpaceX have explicitly stated Mars settlement as a goal, with founder Elon Musk investing billions of his personal wealth alongside company resources into developing the Starship system designed for Mars missions. This private investment supplements government funding, potentially accelerating development and reducing public costs. However, the business case for private Mars missions remains speculative. There's no clear revenue model that would justify the enormous investment required, raising questions about long-term sustainability beyond initial demonstration missions. The return on investment question extends to government funding as well. Critics argue that Mars mission budgets could be better spent addressing pressing Earth problems like climate change, poverty, or disease. Advocates counter that space exploration drives technological innovation with widespread economic benefits, inspires educational achievement, and represents a form of positive international cooperation. This debate intensifies as mission costs rise, requiring increasingly compelling justification for such massive public expenditure. Economic sustainability for Mars exploration likely requires developing new funding models beyond traditional government appropriations. These might include public-private partnerships where government provides basic infrastructure while companies develop specific capabilities for both government missions and potential commercial applications. Long-term economic sustainability might eventually emerge from resource utilization, perhaps mining valuable minerals or developing intellectual property from Mars-based research, though these remain speculative revenue sources at present. The opportunity cost of Mars missions particularly affects space agency budgets. NASA's entire annual budget is approximately $23 billion, meaning a $100 billion Mars program would consume nearly half the agency's resources for 10 years if funded within existing constraints. This would necessarily reduce funding available for Earth observation, astronomy, aeronautics research, and other valuable scientific endeavors. Similar trade-offs would face other space agencies allocating limited resources to Mars exploration. The economic impact extends beyond direct mission costs to include the massive human capital investment required. A Mars program would employ thousands of engineers, scientists, and technicians for decades, representing both a significant expense and a potential economic benefit through high-skilled job creation and technology transfer to other sectors. Historical analysis of Apollo program spending shows approximately 90% remained within the domestic economy, supporting jobs and technical capability development that benefited other industries. Risk management adds another financial dimension to Mars planning. The inherent risks of such missions create pressure to build multiple redundant systems and extensive testing programs that drive costs higher. The potential consequences of mission failure, both human and financial, create strong institutional incentives for conservative approaches that prioritize safety over cost efficiency. The loss of a single Mars mission could potentially end an entire program, wasting the entire prior investment, a risk posture that drives additional precautionary spending. Despite these daunting economic challenges, incremental approaches offer potential paths forward. Developing capabilities through stepping stone missions, perhaps using the Moon as a proving ground for Mars technologies, allows costs to be spread over longer periods while delivering intermediate benefits. Modular architectures permit reuse of components across multiple missions, amortizing development costs and potentially reducing long-term expenses. Advances in manufacturing, materials science, and automation continue reducing the cost of space hardware, gradually improving the economic equation. The economic challenge of Mars exploration ultimately represents a question of priorities and values, rather than absolute financial limitations. The global economy produces trillions of dollars in annual output, making a Mars program financially possible through collective effort if deemed sufficiently important. Whether such missions represent wise investments depends on one's perspective regarding humanity's future, the value of exploration, and the potential long-term benefits of becoming a multi-planetary civilization. The financial hurdle remains formidable but potentially surmountable with sustained commitment and innovative approaches to program funding and execution. While economic considerations shape what's practically possible for Mars missions, another challenge concerns the biological limitations of the human body during long-duration spaceflight. The months-long journey to Mars subjects astronauts to radiation, microgravity, and psychological stress, all taking a cumulative toll on human health and performance. This reality has sparked interest in a technology frequently depicted in science fiction, but currently far from practical reality: hibernation or suspended animation for space travelers. The concept seems elegantly simple. Place astronauts in a state of dramatically reduced metabolic activity during the long transit phases, waking them only when they reach their destination. This approach theoretically offers multiple benefits: reduced consumption of resources like food, water, and oxygen, decreased psychological stress from confinement and boredom, potentially reduced muscle and bone loss, smaller habitat requirements, and possibly even some protection against radiation damage through slower cellular division. Unfortunately, the gap between this theoretical solution and current medical capabilities remains vast. True human hibernation, similar to what bears and certain other mammals experience seasonally, simply doesn't exist as a natural human capacity. Our physiology lacks the biochemical mechanisms that allow hibernating animals to safely reduce core temperature, slow metabolism, and enter torpor for extended periods. Humans who experience hypothermia, low body temperature, suffer progressive organ damage rather than entering a protective state of suspended animation. The closest medical analogue currently available is therapeutic hypothermia, sometimes used after cardiac arrest or certain types of traumatic injury. This procedure involves carefully cooling patients to about 33 degrees Celsius, mildly hypothermic, for periods typically not exceeding 24 to 48 hours. Even this modest cooling requires intensive medical supervision, mechanical ventilation, and careful management of multiple potential complications including cardiac arrhythmias, coagulation disorders, and increased infection risk. Extending such techniques from days to months remains far beyond current capabilities. Research into hibernation-like states has produced some intriguing but preliminary results. Studies involving hydrogen sulfide have demonstrated that this compound can induce a reversible state of reduced metabolism in mice, though similar effects haven't been successfully replicated in larger mammals. Other research has identified specific brain regions involved in hibernation regulation in natural hibernators, suggesting potential targets for future intervention in non-hibernating species like humans. The pharmaceutical approach represents another avenue of investigation. Various drug combinations might theoretically slow metabolism, reduce core temperature, and protect tissues during extended periods of inactivity. However, the complexity of human physiology makes this incredibly challenging. Any such intervention would need to affect multiple organ systems simultaneously in precisely coordinated ways while maintaining critical homeostatic mechanisms. The potential for unexpected side effects or interactions becomes enormous when considering the extended duration required for space travel applications, even if the physiological challenges could be overcome. The practical implementation for space missions introduces additional complexities. Monitoring and maintaining hibernating astronauts would require sophisticated medical systems capable of operating autonomously for months, detecting and responding to any complications without human intervention. Emergency wake-up protocols would be needed for situations requiring crew response, along with procedures for safely reversing the hibernation process, which itself might take days based on current therapeutic hypothermia recovery times. The physical management of inactive astronauts presents further challenges. Without regular movement, complications like pressure ulcers, deep vein thrombosis, and pulmonary problems become significant risks. Current medical practice for comatose patients involves frequent repositioning, range of motion exercises, and various preventive interventions performed by attending healthcare providers, resources that would be extremely limited on a Mars-bound spacecraft. Muscle atrophy and bone loss would likely still occur during hibernation, possibly at reduced but still significant rates. Natural hibernators experience these effects despite having evolved specific protective mechanisms over millions of years. Humans, lacking these adaptations, would potentially face even greater deconditioning. The crew might arrive at Mars physically debilitated precisely when peak performance is needed for the challenging landing phase and initial surface operations. The psychological aspects of hibernation also raise concerns. The experience of being artificially suspended for months and then revived remains completely unknown, with potential for significant psychological distress, cognitive effects, or adjustment difficulties. Questions about memory consolidation, skill retention, and team cohesion following extended hibernation periods remain unanswered and difficult to study meaningfully on Earth. Given these formidable challenges, near-term Mars mission planning has largely set aside hibernation technologies in favor of more conventional approaches focusing on habitat design, radiation protection, and psychological support for conscious crews. However, research continues on potential intermediate applications, perhaps short-duration torpor states of several weeks that could reduce consumable requirements without attempting full mission hibernation. Some researchers have proposed cyclic torpor approaches, where crew members rotate through periods of reduced metabolic state lasting days or weeks, rather than remaining in hibernation for the entire journey. This would allow the active crew to monitor those in torpor while reducing the total resources required compared to everyone remaining continuously active. Such approaches might prove more achievable as an intermediate step between current capabilities and the full hibernation depicted in science fiction. The European Space Agency has funded preliminary studies on torpor-inducing transfer habitats, examining potential habitat designs optimized for crews spending significant portions of the journey in medically induced torpor states. NASA's Innovative Advanced Concepts program has similarly supported early-stage research into hibernation for space applications. These investments, while modest, reflect recognition that breakthrough capabilities in this area could potentially transform the feasibility of long-duration human spaceflight. Alternative approaches to addressing the same fundamental challenges include accelerating transit times through advanced propulsion rather than adapting human physiology to longer journeys. Nuclear thermal propulsion, nuclear electric systems, or other advanced concepts could potentially reduce Earth-Mars transit times from 7 or 8 months to as little as 3 or 4, significantly reducing cumulative radiation exposure, psychological stress, and consumables requirements without requiring hibernation capabilities. The limitations of current hibernation technologies reflect our incomplete understanding of the complex biochemical processes involved in natural torpor states. Advancing this field requires further basic research into the mechanisms used by hibernating mammals, comparative studies across species with different hibernation capabilities, and careful investigation of potential pharmacological or genetic interventions that might safely induce similar states in humans. progress will likely be incremental rather than revolutionary, with potential applications in emergency medicine appearing before space travel implementations. For the foreseeable future, Mars mission planners must work within the constraints of fully conscious, continuously active crews requiring all the psychological support, life sustenance, and habitat volume such missions entail. While hibernation remains an intriguing potential solution to multiple challenges of long-duration spaceflight, it represents a capability that remains firmly on the far horizon of biomedical science rather than a near-term option for Mars exploration. Like many aspects of Mars mission planning, we must balance the inspiring vision of what might eventually be possible against the practical reality of what can actually be accomplished with current or near-term technology.